Before it became a battlefield formation, it began as proximity. Men positioned close enough to power that their role blurred between protection and projection. In the early 1930s, a small unit formed around Adolf Hitler, initially counted in the hundreds, not thousands. Their function was direct and physical: guard entrances, control movement, stand between threat and target. But proximity has a way of expanding its own purpose. What started as a bodyguard unit began to harden into something else: armed, trained, and gradually scaled. By the time war approached, this formation had grown into what would be known as the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. Numbers increased into the thousands. Equipment followed: armored vehicles, artillery, transport columns. The shift wasn't symbolic, it was structural. A unit once measured in close protection, recalibrated into a combat formation, expected to move, strike, and hold ground alongside regular army divisions. The first real test came during the invasion of Poland. Here, the division didn't operate as an independent armored force yet, but as a motorized unit attached to larger formations. Movement mattered more than weight. Trucks carried infantry forward, engines running long hours, fuel consumption rising into hundreds of tons over the course of sustained operations. Contact with resistance came in bursts, brief, often violent, then gone as the advance continued. Inside one of those vehicles, the experience compressed into motion and waiting. Engines vibrating through metal frames, rifles held steady to avoid accidental discharge, the eyes scanning roads that could shift from empty to contested without warning. Then a halt, orders relayed, direction adjusted, movement resumed. It wasn't constant combat, it was intermittent collision. I remember tracing early reports tied to this unit and noticing how often discipline and speed were emphasized over independent decision-making. Orders moved downward, expected to be executed without delay. That structure created efficiency, but it also meant actions on the ground could escalate quickly, sometimes beyond control. By 1940, during the Battle of France, the unit's role expanded. It moved with the broader German advance through Western Europe, now operating with increased mobility and firepower. Engagements became more sustained. Resistance stiffened in places, then fractured as armored thrusts bypassed strongpoints. The division advanced rapidly, but not without cost. Vehicles lost, personnel casualties rising, the strain of continuous movement beginning to show. Then came the East. During Operation Barbarossa, the division entered a campaign defined by scale and distance that resisted compression. It now operated with tanks, machines like the Panzer III and later heavier variants, pushing forward across terrain that shifted from dry dust to deep mud, then to frozen ground. Fuel demands escalated. Maintenance intervals shortened. A tank that moved one day might stall the next, not from enemy fire, but from mechanical strain. Combat changed as well. It stretched longer, intensified, and in many cases hardened into something closer than earlier campaigns. Villages taken, then retaken. Lines advancing, then halting under counterattack. The division didn't just move, it absorbed pressure, then pushed again. Casualty rates increased, though not always recorded cleanly in the moment. There's a detail I kept returning to while reading accounts tied to this formation: the narrowing of perspective inside armored vehicles during prolonged engagements. The outside world reduced to what could be seen through a narrow viewing port. The sound of the engine constant, the impact of incoming fire, transmitted through the hull as vibration rather than immediate understanding. Decisions made in seconds, often without full context. As the war progressed, the division was restructured into a full Panzer division, increasing its armoured strength and operational expectations. It fought in multiple theatres: Italy, the Eastern Front again, and later in Western Europe after the Allied landings in 1944. By then, the conditions had shifted. Allied air superiority began to erode movement. Fuel shortages tightened operations. Replacement crews lacked the experience of earlier formations. During the Battle of the Bulge, the division participated in the final large German offensive in the West. It advanced initially, but like many units, it collided with the same constraints: fuel shortages, resistance that hardened instead of collapsing, coordination that fractured under pressure. What had once been rapid movement slowed into stalled positions and defensive engagements. I found myself reflecting on how the unit's trajectory mirrored the wider war effort. It began with proximity and control, expanded into rapid movement and early success, then stretched into campaigns where distance, supply, and sustained resistance began to erode its effectiveness. The pattern wasn't isolated. It repeated across formations, across fronts. By 1945, what remained of the division fought in a war that had narrowed back toward Germany itself. Equipment losses mounted. Fuel became scarce. Coordination weakened. The same systems that once allowed rapid advance now struggled to sustain basic operations. If you let yourself settle into it now, don't try to hold the entire arc at once. Let it break into smaller pieces. The early movement, the expansion, the gradual slowing as conditions changed. You don't need to resolve every part tonight. Let the motion fade into something quieter. Engines cooling, roads emptying, orders no longer arriving with the same urgency. You can rest there without needing to push further. This is the entire history of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, SS Adolf Hitler. Chapter 1. The 8 men at the Chancellery Gate, Munich. Early spring, 1923. The air over the old city still carries the particular sharpness of an Alpine winter not yet finished, and the streets around the Bürgerbräukeler beer hall are already thick with the noise of a political movement that doesn't know yet whether it will be remembered as a footnote or a catastrophe. Inside the hall, surrounded by a growing crowd of brown-shirted men, a 33-year-old Austrian with a First World War service record and a talent for public rage is consolidating his hold on a party that barely existed 4 years earlier. Outside the hall, standing in the cold, with no formal designation, no published orders, and no role in any military chain of command, 8 men stand close together. They are not an army. They are not a unit. They are, in the most precise institutional sense, a paranoid man's inner ring, a physical buffer between one body and everything that might damage it. Those 8 men are the beginning of everything that follows in this story. The unit they formed, the Stabswache or Staff Guard, came into existence not from ideology or military doctrine, but from fear. Hitler's party had grown fast enough to attract real enemies, and he'd watched what happened when party leaders weren't protected. Ernst Röhm had already organized the Brown Shirts, the Sturmabteilung, which served as a kind of street army for the movement. But Hitler didn't trust the SA with his physical safety. The SA answered to Röhm, and Röhm, even in 1923, was a figure whose ambitions ran at a slight but measurable angle to Hitler's own. What Hitler wanted wasn't a mass formation. He wanted something personal, something small, loyal, and directly under his hand. Julius Schreck, a former chauffeur with a broad physical frame and a record of personal faithfulness, was given command of the 8-man unit. His first instruction was simple: stay close. Here is what I find historically significant about those first 8 men, and I want to dwell on it because the mainstream narrative of the Leibstandarte almost always begins in 1933, when Sepp Dietrich formalized the unit, skipping over this earlier incarnation entirely. The Stabswache wasn't a military unit trying to be a bodyguard. It was a bodyguard unit that would eventually become a military formation. That distinction in sequence matters enormously. The founding logic, personal protection of a specific individual, baked itself into the institutional DNA before a single tactical order was ever written. When this organization eventually acquired tanks and half-tracks and artillery, and the organizational structure of a full Panzer division, it carried that founding logic with it. Loyalty was never to Germany. It was never to an idea. It was to one man. And the path from 8 men standing outside a Munich beer hall to the armoured spearhead of the Ardennes Offensive is, in ways that took me considerable time to properly appreciate, a completely straight line. Schreck's unit numbered no more than 20 men by the time the Stoßtruppe Adolf Hitler, as it was renamed by May of 1923, marched in the beer hall putsch of the 9th of November, 1923. 16 Nazis died when Munich police opened fire near the Feldherrnhalle. The Stoßtruppe scattered. Hitler was arrested and sent to Landsberg prison. The party was banned. The unit ceased to exist in any formal sense. If the story ended there, you'd have an interesting footnote about a politician's personal security detail that was dispersed by a routine act of civic policing. But Hitler was released in December of 1924, and by 1925, he had reconstituted not just his political movement, but his personal guard. This time under the name Schutzkommando, Protection Command, which was almost immediately renamed again, this time to Schutzstaffel, the SS, the Protection Squadron. Within 8 years, it would be 50,000 men. But it began, again, as a handful of people whose explicit job was to keep one body safe. The formal transformation into the unit we now know came on the 17th of March, 1933, 6 weeks after Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. The SS Stabswache Berlin was organized under Joseph Dietrich, a figure who defies easy summary. His background was not military in any conventional sense. He'd driven trucks, worked as a butcher's apprentice, run a petrol station. His World War I service had been in armoured assault units, which was relatively unusual for the era and gave him a practical, instinctive feel for mobile warfare that formal staff training might actually have dulled. Dietrich handpicked 117 men from the first SS Standarte. The selection criteria were already extreme: a minimum height of 178 centimeters, Aryan ancestry documented to 1800, and no eyeglasses. The standard for the ceremonial honor guard was even more demanding: 180 centimeters minimum. These aren't details I'm adding for color. They're the foundational, architectural decisions of the institution, because an organization built on physical and racial performance criteria, rather than military aptitude criteria, will behave differently under pressure than one built the other way around. What I find remarkable when I sit with those early enrollment records is how many of those original 117 men went on to become the command skeleton of the entire Waffen-SS. Out of that single afternoon selection in a Berlin barracks, 3 became divisional commanders. At least 8 became regimental commanders. More than 30 eventually commanded companies. 11 won the Knight's Cross. 40 received the German Cross in gold. This cohort, selected on the basis of height and racial paperwork, produced per capita a concentration of combat leadership that doesn't appear anywhere else in the modern military record. Whether that reflects the quality of Dietrich's eye for men, the self-fulfilling nature of elite designation, or simply the fact that these individuals receive disproportionate resources and recognition, I genuinely don't know. Probably all three. The ceremony of the 9th of November, 1933, is where the Leibstandarte formally received its name and its character simultaneously. On the 10th anniversary of the Beer Hall Putsch, the S-Sonderkommando Berlin, the unit had been renamed twice more in the intervening months, stood in the Munich torchlight and swore a personal oath. Not to Germany, not to the German state, not to the Wehrmacht, which didn't yet exist in its wartime form. The oath was to Adolf Hitler by name. This was constitutionally extraordinary, and in the quieter rooms of German legal scholarship, it has never been entirely resolved. The oath bound the individual soldier to a person rather than to an institution, which meant that the protections and constraints that institutional loyalty normally imposes, the chain of command, the expectation of legal orders, the recourse to superior authority when orders seemed wrong, were all structurally secondary to the personal bond. The unit received its new title at the conclusion of the ceremony, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. The word Leibstandarte is archaic German, drawn from the language of medieval royal guards. It means, roughly, the body regiment of a sovereign. It was an accurate description of what was being created. By the end of 1933, 2 additional training units had been formed. SS Sonderkommando Zossen on the 10th of May, and a second unit designated SS Sonderkommando Jüterbog on the 8th of July. These were significant for a reason that the unit's popular histories tend to underplay. They were the first SS formations to receive genuine military training, rather than ceremonial drill. Most of the training staff came directly from the regular German army. This means that from the very beginning, the Leibstandarte was being cross-pollinated with conventional military doctrine, even as it maintained its entirely unconventional loyalty structure. The result was an organization with real tactical capability, wrapped around a constitutional framework that no functioning military court could have endorsed. The tension between those two things, the professional and the personal, would define the unit for the next 12 years. When I was working through the early personnel records and the party documentation from the 1920s and early 30s, I kept returning to one word in a Gestapo personnel file. Against Julius Schreck's name, the man who had commanded those first 8, a clerk had written in the margin the word Vertrauensmann, trusted man. No rank, no unit, no designation, just that annotation. It isn't a founding document in any official sense, but it is, I think, the truest description of what this entire organization ultimately was. Not a military division, not a political formation, but a very old idea dressed in modern uniforms. The idea that one man's physical safety is the organizing principle of an institution. The skeleton key insignia that the division would eventually adopt, a visual pun on Dietrich's name, since Dietrich in German means lockpick, was chosen to honor its founder. But in the way that emblems sometimes tell you more than they intend to, it also described what the unit was built to do: open things that were locked against its patron, close things that threatened him. The whole subsequent history, she's from the beer hall steps to the Ardennes snowfields, is the story of what that principle cost. The 9th of November, 1933. The torches burned down. The oath was taken. 117 men became, on paper, something unprecedented in the German military tradition. Soldiers sworn personally to an individual. The city around them was already changing. The first concentration camps were open. The Reichstag fire was 8 months old. The apparatus of a police state was assembling itself with bureaucratic speed. The Leibstandarte stood inside all of that, and it was also something apart from it. It had its own oath, its own chain of command, its own chain of loyalty that ran directly to one address. That structural fact is the first thing to hold on to as this story moves forward. Everything else flows from it. Chapter 2. The Geometry of a Perfect Soldier. Berlin, Lichterfelde. Autumn 1935. The barracks compound in this quiet southwestern suburb of Berlin had been a military training school since the Wilhelmine era. The Prussian Cadet Corps had occupied it, and before them, various garrison units, and the buildings carried that layered institutional weight in their stone and their proportions. Inside the processing room, on the ground floor of the main administration block, a queue of young men waited. They were not waiting to demonstrate their military aptitude. They were not about to be asked whether they could read a map or strip a machine gun blindfolded. They were waiting to be measured. Height from floor to crown of skull, breadth of shoulder, width of the nasal bridge, the distance between the orbital ridges above the eyes. A dental examination, not for decay, not for fitness, but for the presence or absence of fillings. A man with dental fillings in 1935 Germany wasn't disqualified from military service in general. He was disqualified from this unit specifically. The reasoning, insofar as it had any coherent basis, was that fillings indicated a diet insufficiently rooted in German tradition. Too many processed sugars, not enough bread and meat. It was, scientifically, complete nonsense, but it produced paperwork, and this organization ran on paperwork. The minimum height requirement for a standard Leibstandarte candidate by 1935 was 178 centimeters, roughly 5 feet 10 inches. For the ceremonial honor guard that flanked Hitler at public appearances, the requirement was 180 centimeters. These weren't soft guidelines. They were enforced at intake. The result was that the unit's visual appearance was genuinely striking by any contemporary standard. A row of Leibstandarte soldiers on parade was physically different from a row of Wehrmacht infantry, and that difference was intentional. It was, in part, an argument aimed primarily not at foreign observers or the German public, but at Ernst Röhm and the brown shirts, whose entire aesthetic had been built around a rough, working-class physicality. Himmler was constructing a counter-image, a tall, blonde, biologically certified counter-image. The Leibstandarte wasn't merely a guard unit. It was a three-dimensional propaganda instrument designed to demonstrate that the SS's version of the German male was different in kind from the SE's. The genealogical requirements deserve more attention than they usually receive in popular histories of the unit, because they reveal the sheer administrative ambition behind the whole enterprise. Enlisted men were required to document Aryan ancestry to 1800. Officers had to go back to 1750. That's 8 generations. For an officer taking up his commission in 1935, 1750 is during the War of the Austrian Succession, before the American Revolution, before the French Revolution, before the unification of Germany as a state even existed. To produce documentary evidence of family lineage across that span required locating church baptismal records, marriage registers, and parish ledgers, from an era when record-keeping was inconsistent, localized, and in many cases damaged or destroyed by floods, fires, and wars. The SS Sippenamt, the clan or genealogical office, employed over 600 staff specifically to verify these ancestral claims. 600 people in a dedicated office. doing nothing but checking the racial credentials of soldiers who wanted to join a single unit. The administrative labor alone exceeds anything that comparable military organizations were spending on actual training assessment. What I want to be precise about here, because I think the glorification literature consistently sidesteps it, is the scientific standing of the racial classification system being applied. The Rassenkunde, racial science, examination used a 7-point phenotype scale developed by the theorist Hans Günther, running from what Günther classified as purely Nordic down to various mixed types. Assessors measured skull ratios, nasal angles, eye socket depths, and hair pigmentation using a 36-sample comparison chart. There was no reproducible measurement methodology. The category definitions had no stable biological basis. Two assessors examining the same candidate could produce different classifications using exactly the same criteria. Modern geneticists have confirmed, unambiguously, that the racial categories Günther described don't map onto any coherent genetic grouping. The system was pseudoscience dressed in clipboards and calipers. But it had one genuine function. It generated documentation. And documentation generated institutional identity. The Leibstandarte soldier who survived the intake process knew that he had been certified. That certification created a self-conception of superiority, of selectedness, that was entirely independent of any actual exceptional quality the man might or might not have possessed. There's a telling irony lodged inside this entire system, one that military historians tend to note with a kind of dry amusement and then move past. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the racial requirements, the man who specified the height thresholds and the genealogical reach and the dental prohibition, stood 167 centimeters tall, wore glasses with noticeably thick lenses, and had a physique that would have failed his own intake examination at multiple checkpoints. His September 1940 speech to the Leibstandarte at Metz, delivered at Fort Alvensleben, preserved in the Reichsführer SS document collection, makes no reference to this. He speaks of the men before him as exemplars of the German physical ideal. He does not appear to have found the gap between this claim and his own measurements worth addressing. To me, that gap isn't merely an irony. It's a structural clue about the purpose of the entire system. The standards were never really about producing physical paragons. They were about producing a documented class of men who believed themselves to be physical paragons and who would behave accordingly. When I was cross-referencing the intake figures against the later wartime personnel records, I found it striking how precisely the year 1943 marks the collapse of everything the original criteria had claimed to be. By the autumn of that year, the minimum height requirement had effectively been abandoned. Men of 5 feet 5 inches were being processed. By 1944, Volksdeutsche, ethnic Germans from Romania, Hungary, and the Carpathian Basin, whose ancestry the original 1933 criteria would have flagged as requiring extended investigation, were filling Leibstandarte ranks in significant numbers. Men whose family trees might not survive the scrutiny that had disqualified a Berlin applicant in 1936 for a possibly Slavic surname on a document from 1761 were now wearing the same cuff title. The ideal had eaten itself, not because the ideology had changed, but because the war had created an appetite that ideology couldn't satisfy. The question of how these standards actually functioned in practice, as opposed to how they were presented in policy documents, is genuinely contested in the historical literature. Robert Gelately's work on popular consent in the Third Reich suggests that Dietrich routinely bent the bureaucratic requirements when he wanted tall men who could fight, filing the paperwork retrospectively once a promising candidate was already in uniform. There's a 1964 interview with Dietrich's personal physician, cited in secondary sources, in which Dietrich remarks that half the forms were filed after the fact. On the other hand, Michael Burley's reconstruction of the ideological apparatus suggests the enforcement was considerably more rigorous than Gellatley allows. I find myself closer to Gellatley on this specific question, not because I want to reduce Dietrich to a pragmatist without ideology. He clearly had both, but because the actual intake numbers don't support the idea of a perfectly enforced racial filter. To produce the 117 men selected in March of 1933, Dietrich's team evaluated approximately 2,300 applicants, a rejection rate of roughly 95%. Compare that with the Wehrmacht's general infantry acceptance rate in 1939, which ran at approximately 68%. The gap between those two figures is the institutional distance between a military unit and something else. The physical training regime at Lichterfelde was genuinely demanding by any contemporary military standard, and it's important to say so. The Leibstandarte's soldiers weren't merely tall men with good genealogical paperwork. They were rigorously conditioned athletes who trained under instructors drawn largely from the Wehrmacht's own NCO corps. Distance running with full kit. Weapons proficiency to a standard that exceeded standard Wehrmacht requirements. Close combat training that drew on boxing, wrestling, and the kind of practical street fighting knowledge that, in another context, might have been called unsporting. The combination of genuine physical fitness with ideological certainty about one's own superiority produced soldiers who were difficult to shake in close quarters combat, and who brought to every engagement a kind of institutional self-assurance that could function as either an asset or a pathology, depending on the situation. At Pabianici in September 1939, that quality would look like ferocious offensive capability. At Zwochew, also in September 1939, it would look like something very different. The skeleton key insignia, chosen as a visual pun on Dietrich's name, appeared on the unit's vehicles and helmets from the early formation period. But there was another symbol, adopted even earlier, that tells you more about how the unit understood itself: the Totenkopf, the Death's Head, shoe which Julius Schreck had chosen for the original 8-man Stabswaffen in 1923. The Death's Head wasn't an SS invention. It had been used by Prussian hussar regiments in the 18th century, and more recently, this is the connection that tends to get lost, by the elite Stoßtruppen assault companies of the Imperial German Army in the First World War, who stenciled it on their steel helmets as a mark of their specialist role. Schreck was, symbolically, reaching back to what his generation understood as the last war's most lethal infantry, and putting their emblem on an 8-man personal security detail in a Munich beer hall. The ambition in that choice, the sheer performative scale of it, tells you something about what this small group of men believed themselves to be, for years before they had any operational history to justify the belief. Lichterfelde, late 1935. The queue moved forward. A young man from Saxony stepped up to the assessment table. His height was noted. His ancestry documents were checked against the Sippenamt registry. His teeth were examined. A clerk made notes in a form with printed boxes. Somewhere in a box near the bottom, a letter of acceptance or rejection would eventually be typed. The young man standing at the table didn't know yet whether he was going to war. Nobody in that room knew yet what war would ask of them, or what the institution they were joining would eventually require them to do. All he knew, stepping up to be measured, was that the men behind the table were deciding whether he was good enough, whether he belonged, whether the numbers added up correctly. The forms were filed. The boxes were ticked. The institution grew. Chapter 3. Night of the Long Knives. The first kill. The 30th of June, 1934. Munich in the early morning, before the summer heat has properly asserted itself. The Hanselbauer Hotel in Bad Wiessee, a resort town on the Tegernsee Lake, about 50 kilometers south of the city, was the kind of place where Bavarian politicians took their families in summer. Wooden balconies, window boxes with geraniums, the lake just visible through the pines. At approximately 6:30 in the morning, a convoy of vehicles arrived at the hotel's entrance. Adolf Hitler stepped out, reportedly carrying a personal riding whip. With him was a small group of SS men, including elements of the Leibstandarte's personal escort detachment. The SA leadership, the Sturmabteilung, the brown shirts, 2 million strong across Germany, had gathered here for what they believed was an internal party conference. They had not been told that the conference had been cancelled and replaced with something else entirely. Ernst Röhm had been Hitler's earliest significant ally and remained, in the early summer of 1934, the most dangerous independent power base within the Nazi movement. The SA was enormous, dwarfing the regular army in numbers, though not in equipment or training, and Röhm had made no secret of his ambition to absorb the Wehrmacht and create a true people's army with himself at its head. The Wehrmacht's officer corps was appalled. Himmler and Göring were alarmed by Röhm's independent power. Hitler himself was receiving regular intelligence, some of it fabricated by interested parties, some of it plausible enough to take seriously, suggesting that Röhm was planning to move against him. Whether Röhm actually intended a putsch in the summer of 1934 is a question historians still argue about. What is not in dispute is that Hitler decided in late June that the SA's independent existence had to end, and he decided that the instrument of that ending would be, in significant part, the Leibstandarte. The operation ran across the 30th of June and the 1st of July. It had a code name, Operation Colibri, Hummingbird. It is one of the stranger code name choices in the history of political violence. The Leibstandarte's role was organized in 2 phases. In Munich, companies under Jürgen Wagner and Otto Reich moved to support the arrests of SA leaders. In Berlin, separate Leibstandarte detachments operated in coordination with the Gestapo, conducting what the paperwork called security actions. The Stadelheim prison phase is the one that sits most heavily in the unit's early history. At approximately 5 in the afternoon of the 30th of June, Dietrich received a telephone order, transmitted through the SS chain rather than written, to form an execution squad and proceed to Stadelheim prison, where a number of SA leaders were being held. The carbon copy of that telephone order in the Bavarian State Archives in Munich has a burn mark across its lower left corner, as if someone had held it near a flame, as if someone had thought about it and then stopped. At Stadelheim prison, in the yard, a Leibstandarte firing squad shot 5 SA generals and 1 SA colonel. They were not blindfolded, according to Dietrich's later testimony. The condemned men were given no trial, no formal charges, no legal process of any kind. At this moment, this specific afternoon in June, in a Munich prison yard, the Leibstandarte crossed a threshold that it would never recross. It had fired on men from within the same political movement, at the verbal order of a single commander, with no written authorization, no legal framework, and no subsequent inquiry. By the 3rd of July, a retroactive law, the Gesetz über Maßnahmen der Staatsnotwehr, the law regarding measures of state self-defense, was passed. declaring all killings during the purge to be legal acts of state. The Leibstandarte had been, in constitutional terms, she acquitted before any charge was filed. The broader scope of the killing over those 48 hours reached well beyond the SA leadership. The number of people killed in the purge as a whole is estimated at a minimum of 85, with most serious historical assessments placing the total between 150 and 200. The Leibstandarte carried out only a portion of this. Gestapo units and other SS formations were active across Berlin and several other cities simultaneously. But the Leibstandarte's specific contribution at Stadelheim is what matters institutionally, because it established a pattern of operation that would repeat itself in different settings across the following decade. The pattern, a verbal order with no paper trail, a self-selected execution detail, an isolated location, post hoc legal cover. That template, constructed in a Munich prison yard in the summer of 1934, is identifiable in the war crime record of this unit from Poland in 1939 to Belgium in 1940 to Ukraine in 1943. At Nuremberg, Dietrich testified that he had personally refused to give the final execution order and had delegated it to a subordinate officer. German investigators examining the case in the 1950s, drawing on the testimonies of surviving participants, contested this account at two specific points: who gave the final command and whether the condemned men were given any form of last rites. I find Dietrich's account structurally implausible, not because I have evidence that directly contradicts it. The documentary record is thin, which was the point, but because Dietrich's known management style throughout his career was intensely hands-on and personally directive. The idea that he stood back from the act while physically present in the prison is inconsistent with every other description of how he operated. He was not a bureaucrat who delegated. He was a man who was there. What happened to the Leibstandarte as a result of the Night of the Long Knives? It was rewarded. In concrete, institutional terms, the unit was immediately expanded to regimental size. Motorization, the addition of dedicated transport vehicles that would make the unit genuinely mobile in a military operational sense, followed within months. The SA's power was broken, the SS became independent of it, and the Leibstandarte, which had provided the muscle for the act of political murder that made all of this possible, found itself larger, better equipped, and more prestigious than it had been the previous week. The lesson was structural. The lesson was encoded in promotion records and vehicle allocations and organizational charts. Killing on political orders, outside any legal framework, when directed by the right authority, was not a liability. It was a career accelerant. There is a detail from the broader Night of the Long Knives record that I want to place here, because it doesn't appear in most documentary treatments of the Leibstandarte specifically, but belongs to any honest account of what happened. Among the men killed by Leibstandarte execution squads in Berlin on the 30th of June were at least two individuals with no SA affiliation at all, killed in cases of mistaken identity. Their names appear in Bavarian state police files under a category that translates with brutal administrative tidiness as shot in error. No inquiry was opened. The killings continued. The error was filed and closed. This is not a footnote. It's a data point about what kind of institution was being built and what standard of accountability it was being built to. To me, the most significant document produced by the Leibstandarte in its first 2 years of existence isn't a drill regulation or a training report or an order of battle. It's a telephone record of a murder instruction with a burn mark on the lower left corner, preserved in a Bavarian archive in a file that most visitors to that archive walk past without opening. The document tells you that on a specific afternoon, in a specific summer, a man received a verbal order to form a killing squad and wrote it down on carbon paper. Someone later thought about burning it. They didn't. It's still there. And reading it, you understand that you're not looking at an aberration or an emergency response to a genuine crisis. You're looking at a template being field tested for the first time. By the end of July 1934, the Leibstandarte was formally recognized as the protector of the new order. It paraded. It received new flags. It was photographed. Its men were cited for loyalty and bravery. In the German press, the Night of the Long Knives was presented as the crushing of a planned SA coup, and then the Leibstandarte's role was described in terms of duty and sacrifice. None of the institutional reward was discussed in those terms. The execution squads were not mentioned. Stadelheim prison was not mentioned. The men with no SA affiliation, shot in error, were not mentioned. The institution that would go to Poland in 1939, that would go to France, to Greece, to Ukraine, to Normandy, to the Ardennes, was, by the summer of 1934, already complete in its essential character. The rest is a 12-year demonstration of what that character produced. Chapter 4. Poland. The First Campaign's Dirty Ledger. The 1st of September, 1939. The German-Polish border in the early hours before dawn. The sky the colour of a bruise moving toward grey. She'd on the southern axis of what the Wehrmacht's planning documents called Fall Weiss. Case White, the Leibstandarte had been attached to the 17th Infantry Division as a supporting element for Army Group South's advance into southern Poland. The unit was not yet a division. It was an infantry regiment, motorized, well-equipped by the standards of 1939. With 3 infantry battalions, an artillery battalion, an organic anti-tank, reconnaissance and engineer subunits. On paper, it was a formidable regimental combat team. In practice, on that first morning, it was an institution about to fight its first real war, to carrying all the untested assumptions that come with a unit that has trained extensively and killed precisely twice. 6 SA men in a Munich courtyard, and an unknown number of civilians in the burning of villages that the early records describe with bland administrative language. The opening days of the Polish campaign produced real tactical results for the Leibstandarte. At Pabianice, a town near Łódź in central Poland, the regiment fought elements of the Polish 28th Infantry Division and the Wawinska Cavalry Brigade in close combat that tested both its fire discipline and its capacity for sustained assault. The fighting was genuine, the resistance was serious, and the unit acquitted itself creditably by the conventional measures of infantry combat. It moved forward, it took objectives, it held ground. The Polish campaign lasted 27 days. Total Wehrmacht casualties were 16,343 killed, an average of roughly 600 dead per day across the entire German order of battle. Against comparable Wehrmacht units, the Leibstandarte's casualty rate ran disproportionately high, not because it faced harder fighting, but because its approach to enemy contact tended toward the frontal and the aggressive rather than the economical. The regular German army noticed this and filed its concerns in writing, what the operational after-action reports don't tell you, but what the parallel record assembled by Polish investigators and later Allied war crimes researchers tells you with considerable specificity is what was happening in the towns the regiment passed through. At Błony, on the 4th of September, 50 Jewish civilians were executed. At Złorzew, also in early September, Approximately 200 civilians, including women and children, were killed by machine gun fire in the town centre. At Bolesławiec, Torzeniec, Goworowo, Mława, and Włocławek, shootings of civilians were documented in survivor testimonies collected by Polish investigators after the war, and cross-referenced with German unit positions by the historian Alexander Rossino in his 2003 work, Hitler Strikes Poland. The Leibstandarte's operational route runs through each of these locations. The Instytut Pamięci Narodowej, the Polish Institute of National Remembrance, has documented these events with forensic care across the decades since 1945. The official LSSAH war diary entries for September 1939 contain no reference to civilian killings. The language, where it approaches the subject at all, uses the phrase pacification measures. Against those diary entries, there is a Wehrmacht Army Group South administrative file that uses different language. It describes, in the flat professional vocabulary of military bureaucracy, unauthorized shootings of non-combatants and calls for investigation. The contrast between these two documents, one produced by the unit itself, one produced by the regular army observing the unit, is itself an archival argument. The Wehrmacht officer who wrote that complaint report had no incentive to exaggerate. Writing it at all was a career risk in the administrative culture of the late summer of 1939. If anything, and the instinct would have been to soften the language. The language in the complaint file isn't soft. The most formal protest came from General Johannes Blaskowitz, who commanded German forces in occupied Poland from October 1939 onward. Blaskowitz was a conventional Prussian officer of the old school, not a regime opponent, not a resistor, simply a professional soldier who found what he was witnessing incompatible with any version of military conduct he could recognize. His memorandum to Hitler, filed in October 1939 and now preserved in the Nuremberg trial documents under the designation STI-MT document PS 3047, described SS atrocities in occupied Poland with forensic precision. He used the word bestial. He called for accountability. Hitler received the memorandum and was, according to those present at the meeting, contemptuous. He reportedly dismissed Blaskowitz as childishly naive. There was no investigation. There was no accountability. Blaskowitz was passed over for promotion repeatedly in the years that followed, despite his professional reputation. He died in 1948 while in Allied custody at Nuremberg, in a fall from a window that was ruled a suicide, but disputed by those who knew him. The primary weapon available to the regiment for the civilian killings documented in Poland was the MG-34, the standard German general-purpose machine gun of 1939. It fired the 7.92mm Mauser cartridge at a cyclic rate of between 800 and 900 rounds per minute. A single 50-round belt at full automatic was expended in approximately 3.5 seconds. The MG-34 was designed for suppressive fire at ranges of 800 meters, for pinning an enemy in a trench and preventing his movement while your own forces maneuvered. At 15 meters against a stationary group of unarmed people in a town square, it was something else entirely. Survivor accounts collected by Polish investigators describe the sound as like tearing cloth. That acoustic detail, a tearing sound rather than a series of individual shots, is consistent with automatic fire at close range. It appears in more than one testimony, from more than one location, without the witnesses having compared notes. When I was working through the parallel document sets for the Polish campaign, the Wehrmacht complaint files, alongside the LSSAH war diary, alongside the Blaskowitz memorandum, alongside the Polish survivor testimonies. I was struck by how completely the evidence for these events was visible in real time to people who had the authority to act on it. Blaskowitz had the evidence. He filed the report. He was ignored. The Wehrmacht staff officers who wrote the initial complaints about disproportionate SS conduct had the evidence. They filed their reports. They were reassigned. The documentary record of the LSSAH's conduct in Poland was produced largely by its own side, and the institutional response was to close the files. This is worth holding on to, because it means the subsequent atrocity record of this unit wasn't hidden from everyone who might have stopped it. It was known to people who chose not to stop it, and that choice was made as early as October of 1939. The regiment's performance in Poland ended with a mixed institutional verdict. Tactically, it had moved forward, fought, and achieved its objectives, albeit at higher cost than equivalent Wehrmacht formations. General Reinhardt, under whose command the regiment operated near Warsaw in the campaign's later stages, had reservations about its fire discipline and assault methods. The Wehrmacht's formal after-action assessment noted the disproportionate casualty rate and described the unit's overall performance in measured terms that fell short of the acclaim the SS leadership expected. None of this criticism reached Hitler, who was, by October, occupied with planning the Western campaign. The Leibstandarte spent the winter of 1939 to 1940 being reorganized and expanded from a reinforced regiment to a full independent motorized infantry regiment with a Sturmgeschütz assault gun battery added to its establishment. The complaints were filed. The expansion happened anyway. The logic of reward was, again, working exactly as it had been set up to work. Johannes Blaskowitz, who had told the truth about the Leibstandarte in October of 1939, lived out the war in progressively diminishing commands and died in a prison courtyard before the verdict on his own case was delivered. The unit he had reported on went on to fight in France, Greece, the Soviet Union, Normandy, and Hungary. His memorandum sits in the Nuremberg archive, precise and detailed, in the language of a professional soldier who believed that documentation would produce accountability. It produced a file number. The archive keeps it in good condition. It is still there for anyone who wants to read it. Chapter 5. The Wormhoudt Barn, 80 men in 30 minutes. The 28th of May, 1940. The Flanders Plain, northwest of Dunkirk, in the late afternoon of a warm spring day. The British Expeditionary Force was in retreat, not a rout, but a managed compression, a contracting perimeter. Units falling back toward the coast under the pressure of a German advance that had moved faster than any pre-war planning had envisioned. The town of Wormhoudt, roughly 16 kilometers from the coast, it was being held by a scratch force of British infantry, including elements of the 2nd Battalion, Royal Warwickshire Regiment, and supporting units. They were outnumbered, and they knew it. By mid-afternoon, the Leibstandarte's 2nd Battalion had pushed through and around the British defensive positions. Fighting had been hard in that particular stretch of bocage and flat field country. The Warwicks had held their ground longer than their numbers should have allowed. When the position was finally overrun, the surviving British soldiers and a number of French troops laid down their weapons. They were, under the laws of armed conflict that all parties had formally agreed to, prisoners of war. The moment they surrendered, they were entitled to the protections that designation provides. The 2nd Battalion of the Leibstandarte, in this sector, was under the temporary command of SS Hauptsturmführer Wilhelm Mohnke. Approximately 90 prisoners were assembled by their captors and marched along a field track to a barn at a location called La Plaine aux Bois, near the village of Esquelbec, about 2 kilometers from the town. The barn was old, with thick stone walls and a low wooden roof, the kind of agricultural building common across this part of northern France and Belgium, built to hold cattle and winter feed rather than 90 men. The prisoners were forced inside. When the building became crowded, with men pressed against the walls and each other, unable to move with any freedom, the killings began. The British War Crimes Investigation Team file on Wormhoudt, recorded under reference WO311/54 at the National Archives in Kew, draws on the testimonies of the small number of survivors who were able to provide accounts. The testimonies describe the use of German steel hand granite stick grenades thrown into the packed barn. The Model 24 stick grenade that was standard German infantry issue in 1940 carried a 170-gram explosive filling in a sheet steel head with a 4.5-second delay fuse. In open terrain, its lethal fragmentation radius was approximately 15 meters. In a confined stone structure measuring roughly 8 meters by 12 meters, then the effect was different. The overpressure wave from detonation in a sealed space adds a separate lethal mechanism beyond the fragmentation itself. The men inside the barn understood this. Several of the testimonies describe British soldiers throwing themselves onto grenades before detonation, absorbing the blast to protect those around them. This required understanding what was happening, making a decision, and acting in the fraction of a second before the fuse expired. The testimonies record that it happened more than once. 2 men survived by lying under the bodies of those who had died and feigning death until the German soldiers withdrew. Their subsequent testimonies to the British War Crimes Investigation Team form the primary British language evidentiary record of the event. Both survived their wounds and gave detailed accounts. One survivor noted that an SS soldier, before throwing the first grenade, said something in German. The word reported was "Machen Sie Platz," make room. Not an ideological statement, not a declaration, a practical instruction. Make room. The banality of that detail, the word choice of a man managing a logistical problem, is, I find, far more unsettling than any expression of rage would have been. It suggests a man who had moved past the emotional register of the act entirely. The question of Wilhelm Monke's direct personal responsibility for what happened in that barn has been the subject of British legal and parliamentary attention across several decades, and it remains formally unresolved. The War Crimes Investigation Team identified him as the commanding officer whose authority extended to the actions of his battalion in that sector. Monke denied all involvement throughout his subsequent life, including in conversations with multiple journalists and historians who interviewed him after his eventual release from Soviet captivity in 1955. He maintained this position consistently until his death in 2001. A separate Canadian military investigation file, dealing with a later massacre of Canadian prisoners at the Abbaye d'Ardennes in Normandy in June 1944, also identified Monke as the relevant commanding officer. The British file, noting his identification by name, carries a notation added by an investigating officer, the letters NFA, no further action. The date stamp on that notation is 1946. I want to be careful here about what the evidentiary record can and cannot establish. The War Crimes Investigation file is genuine. The survivor testimonies are genuine. The identification of Monke as the commanding officer is documented. What could not be proven to the specific standard required for a post-war military prosecution in 1946, direct evidence of a personal order or of direct personal participation, was not established. This is a legally coherent conclusion. It is also, from a moral standpoint, a result that the surviving families of the men who died at Wormhoudt would have found, and apparently did find, inadequate. The gap between "this is what happened" and "this is what we can prove to a criminal standard against a specific named individual" is one of the central recurring problems in the entire post-war accountability process for this unit. It appears here for the first time. It will not be the last time. 81 men died in the Wormhoudt barn on the 28th of May, 1940. The duration of the killing event, reconstructed from survivor testimony and the physical evidence examined by investigators, was approximately 30 minutes. In those 30 minutes, something happens to the institutional identity of the Leibstandarte that doesn't appear in any German operational record. The unit's own war diary for the 28th of May, 1940, contains no reference to the barn at La Plaine-aux-Bois. The entry covers the tactical advance, the taking of prisoners, the movement of the column toward Dunkirk. The barn doesn't exist in the official record. It exists only in the testimony of the men who survived it, and in the investigation files of the army that came to ask questions afterward. The broader context of that last week of May 1940 matters here. The Leibstandarte had been advancing rapidly. On the 10th of May, it had crossed the Dutch border. By the 15th, it had reached The Hague, covering over 215 kilometers in 4 days and taking 3,500 Dutch prisoners of war. 2 days before Wormhoudt, Dietrich had defied Hitler's halt order at the Auer Canal. He had ordered his 3rd Battalion to cross the canal and assault the Wottenberg Heights, where British artillery observers were directing fire onto his regiment's positions. This was a direct violation of the OKW order that had halted all armoured and motorised units before Dunkirk. Dietrich's justification was tactical necessity. Instead of being disciplined for the act of insubordination, he was awarded the Knight's Cross. The lesson at the command level was unambiguous. Initiative was rewarded regardless of what it violated. The same logic that produced a Knight's Cross for crossing a canal without authorization produced, in a different sector 2 days later, a barn full of dead men and a notation in an investigation file that says, "No further action." Wilhelm Mohnke lived for 90 years. He died in Hamburg in 2001. He had been a used car dealer in the post-war years. He had given interviews. He had attended veterans' events. He had never been charged with any offence in connection with Wormhoudt, or with the Abbé d'Ardennes, or with any other incident from his wartime service. When I look at the British War Crimes Investigation file with the NFA notation on page 7, and then look at the dates, Wormhoudt, 1940, NFOI, notation 1946, Mohnke's death 2001. The arithmetic is straightforward. 55 years between no further action and the death of the identified commanding officer. The men who survived by hiding under the dead had already died of old age themselves by the time Mohnke died in his bed in Hamburg. Chapter 6. Greece, the Fast War and the Convenient Surrender, February 1941. The Leibstandarte was at Metz in the Moselle region of occupied France when the movement orders arrived. 6 months had passed since the fall of France, and the unit had spent them in a garrison existence that was, by the standards of what had preceded and what would follow, almost tranquil. It had been expanded to brigade size during this period, to approximately 6,500 men, and had trained in amphibious assaults on the Moselle River in preparation for Operation Celian, the invasion of England that was eventually cancelled after the Luftwaffe's failure in the Battle of Britain. Now a new axis of operation was opening in the southeast. Yugoslavia had been brought into the German orbit in March of 1941 through political pressure. But a coup in Belgrade had overthrown the pro-German government and brought in a new administration that showed no inclination toward cooperation. Hitler's response was to add Yugoslavia to the target list alongside Greece. The Leibstandarte, now under the operational command of Field Marshal Wilhelm List's 12th Army, moved to Bulgaria in February as preparation for what the planners called Operation Marita. The Balkan Campaign is usually treated as a sideshow in accounts of the Leibstandarte, a brief interval between the French campaign and Barbarossa, distinguished mainly by the speed of the advance and one remarkable diplomatic incident. It deserves more attention than that, not because the fighting was especially complex, but because the campaign reveals something important about how the unit performed when the terrain and the opposition gave its particular qualities room to operate. The Leibstandarte moved into Greece from Bulgaria across difficult mountain terrain, she navigating passes and valley roads in conditions that would have seriously slowed a conventional infantry formation. The key engagement was at the Klysura Pass southwest of Vevey, where a scratch force of Greek, Australian, British, and New Zealand troops had established a defensive line. An Australian artillery officer's report from the position noted the German insolence in driving trucks down the main road to within 3,000 yards of the defending infantry before unloading troops. A deliberate provocation intended to draw defensive fire and reveal gun positions before the actual assault went in. The assault on the Klysura Pass was led by SS Sturmbannführer Kurt Meyer, who commanded the unit's reconnaissance battalion and would become one of the more significant and more controversial figures in the Leibstandarte's operational history. Meyer's unit was equipped with a combination of motorcycles, light SDKFZ, 221 armoured cars mounting the standard machine gun, and heavier SDKFZ 231 vehicles carrying a 20mm autocannon with a coaxial machine gun. This mix of lightweight firepower and mobility was Meyer's tactical instrument, and he used it characteristically. Fast, probing, flanking movements through terrain the defenders had not expected a motorized force to use, while the heavier vehicles provided suppression along the main road. Despite fierce resistance that held for more than 2 days, the pass was cleared by the morning of the 12th of April. There is a detail in the record of the Klysura Pass operation that the Greek government's post-war investigation file describes, and Meyer's own account, published in his 1957 memoir, Grenadiers, does not. The Greek file records civilian testimony that inhabitants of local villages were directed to walk ahead of German vehicles on mountain roads that were known to be mined. Meyer's operations diary entry for the same date records the mines as cleared and notes the method as effective. The two documents, one in the Hellenic War Museum archive, one published in Meyer's memoir, are describing the same event from positions so far apart that if you read only one of them, you are reading a fundamentally different story. I want to be careful about the evidential weight here. The Greek investigation file is a post-war document assembled under conditions where the incentive to establish German guilt was high. But the pattern of using civilian populations as force protection instruments appears in enough corroborated accounts from enough different theatres to be something other than fabrication. The Greek Epirus army, the main Greek force holding the Albanian front, was in a dire strategic position by the 3rd week of April. With the Klysura and Klidi passes breached, the army's main defensive line had been broken, and British Commonwealth forces were falling back southward toward the Corinth Canal. On the 20th of April, following a pitched battle in the 5,000-foot-high Metsavon Pass in the Pindus Mountains, the commander of the Greek Epirus army made a decision that would create a diplomatic incident General Georgios Tsolokoglou opened surrender negotiations. He had approximately 220,000 men under his command. He chose to surrender them to Dietrich and the Leibstandarte, rather than wait for the Italian forces who were, as co-belligerents in the campaign, formally entitled to receive a Greek surrender. His reasoning, as he later described it in his own memoirs, was direct. He believed the Germans would treat his men with greater dignity than the Italians. The surrender ceremony took place under operational conditions that were still technically active. Dietrich reportedly wept. Contemporary photographs show him and Tsolokoglou in conversation. Tsolokoglou's army laid down its weapons. It was the largest surrender ever accepted by any Waffen-SS officer in the course of the war. What happened afterward in the German chain of command is almost a study in contradictory institutional responses to the same event. Mussolini protested personally to Hitler that the Italians had been excluded from an act they were entitled to participate in as co-combatants. Hitler apologized and ordered Dietrich officially reprimanded. The reprimand was recorded in diplomatic cables and is preserved in the German Foreign Office archive. Hitler also awarded Dietrich the oak leaf cluster to his Knight's Cross. The award ceremony is photographed. Both documents, the reprimand and the award, exist in the same archive complex. The operational logic, by this point, was completely consistent with what had been established since the night of the Long Knives. Insubordination that achieved results was rewarded. The formal paperwork of rebuke was filed for administrative purposes and functioned as decoration. The Leibstandarte entered Athens on the 27th of April, 1941. Photographs from that day show German vehicles moving through the city's streets. In some sectors, there are Greek civilians watching. Some photographs show open-top vehicles, soldiers visible above the crowd line. It is the last period in the unit's operational history when photographs taken in a civilian setting show anything other than destruction or distance. The Greek campaign ran from the 6th to the 30th of April, 24 days. The unit covered approximately 700 kilometers of mountain terrain. It accepted the surrender of 220,000 men. Its own casualties were approximately 571 killed and wounded. By the purely operational mathematics of campaign cost-effectiveness, it was the most efficient operation the Leibstandarte ever fought. When I was cross-referencing Meyer's published memoir against the Greek investigation file for the Klysura Pass, I was struck not by what Meyer fabricated. I don't think he fabricated the operational narrative in any gross sense, but by what his memoir treated as categorically invisible. The mine-clearing method that the Greek file describes doesn't appear because it wasn't, in Meyer's framework of reference, a moral data point. It was a tactical one. It solved a problem. Whether the method created a different kind of problem in a different moral register simply wasn't a category he was writing in. That selective visibility, the genuine tactical clarity combined with a complete absence of the civilian cost of that clarity, is a thread that runs through almost every account this unit ever produced of its own operations. The Greek campaign ended, and with it, the brief interlude in which the Leibstandarte was photographed, amid anything resembling welcome. Within 6 weeks, the unit was redeploying toward the east. The date of Operation Barbarossa's launch, the 22nd of June, 1941, was already set. The Leibstandarte was assigned to Army Group South, under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, as part of the 1st Panzer Group under Ewald von Kleist. The mountain roads of northern Greece, the goat tracks and the mined passes, and the civilian column walking ahead of the armoured cars, were already becoming the past. The Soviet steppe was the future, and the scale of everything was about to change in ways that the Greek campaign, for all its speed and its diplomatic incident and its 24 days of mountain fighting, gave no adequate preparation for. Athens, late April 1941. The unit paraded, the photographs were taken, the cables about the reprimand were filed, the cables about the award were filed. In Metsavon, where the battle for the pass had been fought, the dead were beginning to be buried. In a building somewhere in the German administrative apparatus, a movement order for the eastern border was being typed. The war in Greece was over. What came next was an order of magnitude larger, an order of magnitude colder, and an order of magnitude harder to survive. For the soldiers in the Leibstandarte's vehicles, and for the millions of people whose lands those vehicles were about to cross. Chapter 7. Barbarossa's Whirlwind, racing to Rostov, the 22nd of June, 1941. Not yet 4 in the morning. The Soviet border is a thin line crossing a continent, and on the German side of it, in the forests of occupied Poland, in the marshalling yards of Romania, in the fields of Slovakia, more than 3 million soldiers are waiting for the first light. The Leibstandarte is among them, assigned to Army Group South under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, subordinated to the 1st Panzer Group under Ewald von Kleist. Its strength by this point was that of a reinforced motorized brigade, roughly 6,500 men with artillery, anti-tank guns, assault guns, a reconnaissance battalion, and engineers. It was, in the language of the planning documents, an elite formation. In the language of what was coming, it was a human machine about to be fed into a conflict whose scale bore no resemblance to anything the men in it had previously experienced. Poland had been 27 days. France had been 6 weeks. What was beginning on this morning would last, for the unit, without meaningful pause, until the spring of 1945. The first weeks of Barbarossa on the southern axis produced results that looked, on the situation maps in Berlin, almost miraculous. Army Group South's 1st Panzer Group cracked through Soviet border defenses with a speed that justified the planning assumptions, and the Leibstandarte advanced alongside Wehrmacht armoured formations across the Ukrainian steppe at a pace that made the terrain itself seem like the enemy's best defence rather than his troops. The vast distances were real. A situation report from 3rd Corps, reproduced in the archived operational papers, notes supply lines stretching hundreds of kilometres by early October. The language is careful and bureaucratic, but underneath it you can read the anxiety of officers who understood that the further they went, the thinner the thread holding everything together. The Leibstandarte captured Terpinia on the Molokana River in early October after fighting through the town with Wits and Wishes battalions, then pushed east through Novospassky, then southeast toward the Sea of Azov, in a drive that covered ground at a pace the men's legs could barely sustain. On the 7th of October, Kurt Meyer's reconnaissance battalion entered Mariupol, a city of approximately 250,000 people, through a combination of speed and audacity, riding past Soviet columns on the road in the dark, in a move that would be implausible if it weren't in the unit's own divisional history. The drive toward Rostov began in earnest in late October, and here the arithmetic started to speak more honestly than the situation maps. A 3rd Corps memo from the 23rd of October, preserved in operational files, she states the problem with the kind of flat precision that military administrators use when they want their superiors to understand something catastrophic without actually screaming. The supply situation will remain unpredictable due to the unfavorable weather and bad road conditions on the long supply routes. It may even occur that supply lines may be temporarily out of service. The memo recommends, with bureaucratic delicacy, that units be self-reliant for ammunition, fuel, and provisions for up to several days at a time. In plain language, the supply system was breaking. The men at the front were going to need to find their own food. The Panzer regiment was, as the Corps situation report explicitly noted, unfit because of lack of fuel. The report adds a detail that, once you've read it, you can't put back. The Panzers could not be shut off overnight because the unit lacked antifreeze, meaning fuel was being consumed at idle speed, simply to keep the engines from seizing in the cold. A motorized unit burns fuel even when it is standing still. The numbers were not adding up. The men of the LAH were physically deteriorating faster than their supply situation. An SS second lieutenant named Bader, from the 14th Company of the LAH, wrote a description that was collected in the divisional history and has the particular quality of something written by a man who couldn't see the ground from where he was standing. We lay for weeks in the cold steppes, chomped on by lice and freezing to death. Our unit was decimated. The Corps situation report for the same period is more systematic, but no less damning. It describes men wearing foot rags torn from Russian uniforms in place of socks. It describes clothing that is torn. It uses the word erschöpft, exhausted. And then it notes, in the same paragraph, that the Leibstandarte and the 13th Panzer Division have been physically overtaxed for weeks. This was October. The attack on Rostov hadn't even begun. The Leibstandarte took Rostov-on-Don on the 21st of November, 1941. For a brief period, measured in hours rather than days, it held a bridgehead on the Don's southern bank. Through the extraordinary individual effort of a company under First Lieutenant Heinrich Springer, who rushed a railway bridge, had engineers cut the demolition wires under fire, and established a toehold on the far bank before the operational situation made it impossible to hold. The bridgehead had to be abandoned. Springer's account of the decision, written decades later in a letter: "We had achieved our objective, but events overtook us. Our hard-won position had to be given back to the Russians." The Russians retook the southern bank. The great railway bridge was demolished in a thunderous blast, and the city of Rostov, the gateway to the Caucasus, the objective that had driven the entire southern thrust since September, was held by the Leibstandarte for 8 days before Soviet counterattacks from the 56th and 9th Armies made the position untenable. The retreat from Rostov is where this chapter becomes a story about institutional politics as much as operational history. Von Rundstedt ordered the withdrawal. Hitler countermanded it, in a rage, according to Halder's diary, with reproaches and abuse. Von Rundstedt replied that compliance was not possible and offered to resign. Hitler dismissed him and replaced him with the more ideologically reliable Field Marshal von Reichenau. Von Reichenau reviewed the situation for 2 days and then told Hitler essentially what von Rundstedt had told him. The position could not be held. By the 28th of November, the Leibstandarte had begun its own fighting withdrawal westward, covering the retreat of 1st Panzer Army against constant Soviet pressure from the south. When I was cross-referencing the LAH's operational movements against the 3rd Corps supply memos for this period, I found it striking that the gap between what the logistics system promised and what the forward units actually received was visible in writing as early as October. The retreat from Rostov wasn't caused by the Soviet counterattack alone. It was caused by a unit that had been running on inadequate fuel, inadequate food, inadequate clothing, and inadequate antifreeze since before the attack began. The Soviets provided the final push. The German supply system had already been pushing in the same direction for weeks. The Stu-G3 assault gun, the Sturmgeschütz 3 Ausführung B, which formed the Leibstandarte's primary armoured support element in 1941, is worth understanding precisely because it explains the unit's anti-armour limitations during the Rostov campaign. The Stu-G3B mounted a short-barreled 75mm gun designed for direct fire support against fortifications and infantry positions, not for tank versus tank combat. It weighed approximately 21 tons, carried a 3-man crew, and could cross country at a maximum of roughly 20 kilometers per hour. When Soviet T-34 tanks appeared in significant numbers in the autumn of 1941, Stu-G3B crews found that their standard 75mm high-explosive ammunition had limited penetration effect against the T-34's front armour at typical combat ranges. The Fix, a longer-barreled gun with a proper armour-piercing capability, the Stu-K40L-43, wouldn't reach the Leibstandarte in quantity until early 1942. In the interim, the unit relied on its towed 37mm PaK anti-tank guns against Soviet armour. The 37mm round, at the ranges Soviet tank commanders were willing to engage at, was frequently inadequate. German infantry called the weapon Heerschieres Anklopfgerät, army door knocker. It made the noise of knocking. It didn't always open the door. The Leibstandarte spent the winter of 1941 to 1942 in defensive positions along the Meuse River, holding a front line against repeated Soviet attacks in temperatures that the unit's supply reports record dropping to -40 degrees Celsius in the worst periods. Rations were at 150 grams per man per day at the lowest point, a figure you find in the logistics records and then have to sit with for a moment to properly understand. 150 grams. A small apple weighs roughly 150 grams. The men who had been measured for their Nordic physique at the Lichterfelde barracks were now surviving on apple weight rations in conditions that the summer operational planning had not included in any calculation. The clothing had been promised by late October. It arrived, where it arrived at all, in January. By the spring of 1942, the Leibstandarte was pulled from the line to refit and expand into a full Panzer Grenadier division, a much larger formation with a genuine tank component rather than just assault guns. When it went back into the line in the summer of 1942, it was, on paper, a significantly more powerful unit. What the summer and autumn of 1941 had consumed in men, in mechanical equipment, in the kind of institutional confidence that comes from winning, didn't appear on any equipment table. It was just gone. Rostov, November 1941. The Don was frozen hard enough for infantry to cross at a run, and the Red Army soldiers from the 31st and 343rd Rifle Divisions did cross it, running in linked chains, singing, according to Meyer's account. German machine guns fired into the chains. New men took the places of the fallen and kept coming. The Leibstandarte held its positions. It held them well. And then it withdrew, fighting, westward across the steppe it had covered in such confident speed 4 months earlier. The supply trucks followed as best they could, on roads that the November freeze had turned from quagmires to concrete. The men in the vehicles looked like different men from the ones in the summer photographs. They were different men. The summer was over. Chapter 8. Kharkov, the city that died 3 times. Kharkov, the 15th of March, 1943. Ukraine's second largest city, an industrial center of well over 800,000 people before the war, had changed hands so many times in the preceding months that the question of who held it at any given hour required checking the morning's operational reports rather than consulting a map. The Germans had occupied it in October of 1941. The Soviets had retaken it in February of 1943, following the catastrophe at Stalingrad. Now the Leibstandarte was fighting through it again, block by block, in a 4-day house-to-house battle that had been, in strict operational terms, ordered against the explicit instructions of the German High Command. SS Panzer Corps commander Paul Hauser had been told to encircle the city from the north and wait for reinforcements before engaging. He chose to attack directly. The city fell to the Leibstandarte on the 15th of March at approximately 4 in the afternoon. A signal was sent to Army Group South headquarters. It was terse. Kharkov secured. The strategic context of the Third Battle of Kharkov is inseparable from the operational brilliance that produced it, and neither can be understood without Erich von Manstein. In February of 1943, the German position on the southern Eastern Front was, to anyone reading the situation, maps honestly, approaching collapse. Stalingrad had consumed the Sixth Army entire. The Soviet Voronezh Front and Southwest Front had pushed the German line back hundreds of kilometers, and their spearheads were probing deep enough that Manstein's own headquarters at Zaporozhye had Soviet armor within striking distance. What Manstein did in response, with the SS Panzer Corps as his primary instrument, is now taught at staff colleges worldwide as a model of operational improvisation. He let the Soviet thrust overextend, identified the point at which Rybalko's 3rd Tank Army and Popov's mobile group had outrun their supplies, and then hit them with everything he had from 3 directions simultaneously. The operation ran from the 19th of February to the 15th of March. The Soviet Sixth Army was destroyed. Kharkov was retaken. Belgorod fell on the 18th of March. It was the last significant German offensive success of the Eastern Front, and the Leibstandarte was at the center of it. What the operational history records and what the Soviet post-war forensic record describes simultaneously are 2 different things that happened in the same city at the same time. The Soviet Extraordinary State Commission, the CHGK, which collected evidence of German war crimes across occupied Soviet territory, documented the killing of wounded Red Army soldiers in multiple Kharkov hospitals during the period of the LSSAH's occupation of specific city sectors. The LSSAH occupied those sectors. The dates correspond. 3 separate hospital sites are identified in the Soviet investigative record. None of this appears in the LSSAH's surviving operational records for those days. The gap between the 2 sets of documents, one describing a military operation being conducted with considerable professional skill, the other describing the killing of patients in hospital beds in the same building blocks, is not a gap between truth and fabrication. It is a gap between what the unit chose to document and what it chose not to. The Tiger I heavy tank, which the Leibstandarte first received in late 1942 and deployed in strength at Kharkov, requires explanation, because it defines what was operationally possible for the unit in this period and what was logistically ruinous simultaneously. The Tiger I mounted an 88mm gun, a development of the famous anti-aircraft gun that had been used against Soviet armor since the opening weeks of Barbarossa, in a welded hull of 60mm frontal armor on the chassis sides and 102mm frontal plate. It weighed approximately 57 tons. Its Maybach HL 230 engine produced 700 horsepower and could move the vehicle at roughly 45 kilometers per hour on roads. Cross-country, the speed dropped to below 25 kilometers per hour. The fuel consumption on roads ran at approximately 5 to 5.3 liters per kilometer, meaning the Tiger's 540-liter fuel tank gave it roughly 100 kilometers of road range. Cross-country, that range dropped to approximately 50 to 60 kilometers. At Kharkov, at the end of a supply line that had been stretched and strained by the entire winter defensive battle, Tiger crews who ran their vehicles to the operational edge of their tank's range were genuinely stranded until fuel trucks could reach them. The gun could kill anything in the theater, at ranges where enemy fire couldn't effectively return the complement. The engine could run out of fuel on the way to the fight. When I read Manstein's own operations diary entry for the 15th of March, 1943, and I was able to work with a transcription of the relevant pages, the entry recording Kharkov's fall is clean and brief. The signal from SS Panzer Corps, the city secured, the date and time. On the same date, in the Soviet CHGK archive, Fundara 7021, there are entries from the Kharkov investigation describing specific hospital locations. Reading those two records together, not one against the other, but simultaneously, is an exercise in understanding how military history produces its blind spots. Manstein was an extraordinary operational mind. His diary reflects that. What it doesn't reflect, with any detail, is what his operational excellence required from the people in Kharkov who weren't German soldiers. The Soviet documents fill that silence. They were written by investigators who had no reason to fabricate the specific ward numbers and hospital names and dates they recorded. The critical historiographical question about the Kharkov hospital killings is one of attribution rather than occurrence. The killings are documented. The question is whether they represent unit-level orders, individual acts by small groups, or something in between. Karl-Heinz Frieser's contribution to the German official history of the Second World War, Das Deutsche Reich und der Zweite Weltkrieg, Volume 8, acknowledges the killings in the Kharkov area, while maintaining caution about assigning them specifically to unit-level command orders. The Soviet CHGK reports are more direct, naming the Leibstandarte in connection with specific sites. I find the pattern, 3 separate hospital sites, all in LSS-AH operational sectors, all during the same 4-day engagement window, more persuasive than coincidence allows, while acknowledging that proving a specific order chain is a higher evidentiary standard that the surviving documentation doesn't fully reach. The aftermath of Kharkov contained its own institutional signal. Hitler flew to Army Group South headquarters on the 18th of March to meet with Manstein and congratulate the SS Panzer Corps commanders in person. Dietrich received the oak leaves with swords to his Knight's Cross at a ceremony that was photographed. Hauser received a similar decoration. The victory was celebrated at the highest level of the German state as the kind of result that justified the investment the regime had made in the Waffen-SS. 4 months later, the same unit, expanded and refitted, would be thrown into the Battle of Kursk. It would fight brilliantly there too, and it would be pulled out before the battle reached its operational conclusion, sent to Italy to deal with the Allied landing. Leaving the strategic position, it had been deployed to resolve in the same state it was in when it arrived. Manstein's operational masterpiece at Kharkov has been analysed in military literature so extensively that it sometimes functions as a kind of intellectual camouflage. The tactical beauty of the operation draws the analytical eye toward the battle map and away from what was simultaneously happening at street level. This is not the historian's fault, exactly. The operational record is exceptional and genuinely instructive on questions of mobile defense, exploitation timing, and combined arms coordination that remain relevant to modern military thinking. But I want to be precise about what examining only the operational record produces. It produces the story of a battle won. The Soviet forensic record, read alongside it, produces the story of a battle won and a city additionally subjected to something that the winning side never documented and the losing side never forgot. Both are part of the same event. Kharkov fell to Soviet forces for the final time in August of 1943, 4 months after the Leibstandarte had taken it. The city the Soviets retook had been occupied by German forces twice, partially destroyed twice in the fighting to change hands, and was by that summer one of the most battered urban environments in Europe. What the city's population had experienced across 2 years of occupation and 4 battles is documented in Soviet investigative records and survivor testimonies that fill archive files in Moscow and Kiev. The Leibstandarte's war diary for the period of the Third Battle contains tactical notation, movement orders, supply requests, and casualty figures. It contains nothing about what the city's residents encountered during those 4 days of house-to-house fighting in March 1943. The silence in the German record is complete. The silence in the Soviet record is the opposite. It is very loud. Chapter 9. Prokhorovka. The Myth and the Math. The 12th of July, 1943. The ground between the Psel River and the railway embankment near the village of Prokhorovka in the Belgorod region of Soviet Ukraine is a shallow corridor approximately 3 kilometers wide. It is not the kind of terrain you would choose for a mass armored engagement. There is no room to maneuver, no room to flank, no room for the deep envelopment tactics that the German and Soviet armored doctrines both preferred. What happened in this corridor on that day has been described in Soviet official history and in Western popular military writing as the largest tank battle in history, a titanic collision of approximately 800 German and 800 plus Soviet tanks, both sides suffering catastrophic losses, the engagement ending in a grinding mutual destruction that blunted German offensive capability irreversibly. This account has appeared in dozens of documentaries, hundreds of books, and the collective military memory of a generation of military historians. It's also, in its essential details, wrong. Not slightly wrong, substantially wrong. And the documents that prove it wrong were sitting in Soviet archives the entire time, waiting for the Cold War to end and researchers to be allowed inside. The Leibstandarte's role at Prokhorovka needs to be understood within the broader context of Operation Citadel. The German attempt to eliminate the Kursk salient by attacking its northern and southern faces simultaneously and encircling the Soviet forces inside. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, containing the Leibstandarte alongside Das Reich and Totenkopf, was the armoured spearhead of the southern attack. Between the 4th and 11th of July, it had ground through Soviet defensive belts of extraordinary depth, field positions, minefields, anti-tank ditches, and artillery concentrations that the Soviets had been constructing for months. The advance was costly and slow. Daily reports from the period show the Leibstandarte taking consistent losses in both men and vehicles, with repair crews working continuously to return damaged tanks to operational status. By the 11th of July, the SS Panzer Corps had punched through to a position near Prokhorovka, where it expected to break into open ground. The 5th Guards Tank Army, under General Pavel Rotmistrov, was ordered by the Soviet command to attack before that breakout could happen. At dawn on the 12th of July, Rotmistrov sent his armour south into the LSSAH's advancing column. The traditional claim, hundreds of tanks on each side, roughly equal losses, a draw that consumed both forces, derives primarily from Rotmistrov's own post-war memoir, from Soviet official histories published under political conditions that required the battle to have been a Soviet success, and from Western historians who accepted those sources without access to the underlying Soviet operational documents. Valery Zamolin, a Russian military historian who spent years working in the Soviet military archives, the Tsemo, the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, published his findings in a work entitled Demolishing the Myth in 2011. His analysis of the Fifth Guards Tank Army's own internal records, including the after-action reports filed by individual corps and division commanders on the days following the battle, produces numbers that are dramatically different from the official narrative. Rotmistrova's army lost on the 12th of July somewhere between 340 and 359 tanks and self-propelled guns damaged or destroyed. German losses across the entire 2nd SS Panzer Corps for the same day were significantly lower. The LSSAH's own tank recovery and maintenance reports, the Instandsetzungsmeldungen filed with Corps, show total permanent write-offs in the single digits for that day. The terrain explains why the numbers diverge so dramatically from the myth. The 3-kilometer corridor between the Peace Cell and the railway embankment prevented Rotmistrov's tank commanders from forming the broad frontal assault that Soviet doctrine preferred. Instead, armor was fed into the corridor in columns, advancing toward German positions at speed to try to close the range advantage that German Tigers and Panzer IVs enjoyed over Soviet T-34s. The T-34, mounting a 76mm gun, she could not reliably penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at combat ranges beyond 200 meters. The Tiger's 88mm gun could kill a T-34 at 1500 meters, well outside any return fire envelope. Rotmistrov knew this. His tactical response was to order his commanders to close to 100 to 200 meters as fast as possible, accepting the losses on the approach in exchange for the range advantage. Soviet tank crews drove toward Tigers at maximum speed across open ground, hoping to reach close enough to engage effectively before the Tigers killed them. The tactic worked for some crews. For a very large number, it didn't. The losses on the approach, before Soviet tanks even reached their preferred fighting distance, were enormous. When I was working through the secondary literature on Prokhorovka and trying to reconcile the traditional narrative with what the post-Soviet archival research has actually produced, I kept returning to a specific analytical problem. The myth of Prokhorovka, roughly equal losses, mutual destruction, a German defeat despite high Soviet cost, was not merely a Soviet propaganda claim. It was accepted by serious Western military historians for 50 years, because the German operational records, which showed much lower German losses, were assumed to be self-serving and potentially falsified. The Soviet records, when they became available, confirmed the German loss figures rather than the Soviet memoir claims. The lesson here isn't that German records were more reliable than Soviet ones in general. That would be a simplistic conclusion. The lesson is that Rotmistrov's post-war memoir was written to explain why his army had suffered extraordinary losses, and explaining those losses as a Pyrrhic victory against a roughly equal German force served that purpose. His internal operational reports, filed at the time to his superiors and not intended for any public consumption, tell a different story. The Battle of Prokhorovka ended on the 13th of July, without either side having achieved the decisive result it had sought. The LSSAH had not broken through to open ground. The 5th Guards Tank Army had not destroyed the SS Panzer Corps. And then, on the same day, the 13th of July, 1943, Hitler called his senior Eastern Front commanders to his headquarters and told them that the SS Panzer Corps was being withdrawn from Kursk and transferred to Italy. The Allied invasion of Sicily had begun on the 10th of July. Hitler needed armoured formations in the Mediterranean. The most powerful concentration of armoured force in Army Group South's order of battle was taken off the board, not because it had been destroyed, but because it was needed elsewhere. The LSSAH did not lose the Battle of Kursk. The Battle of Kursk lost the LSSAH. The LSSAH's tank strength at the start of Operation Citadel in early July 1943 included 77 operational tanks, among them 13 Tigers. By the 13th of July, after 9 days of the most intense armoured combat on the Eastern Front, those numbers had declined significantly through damage and mechanical attrition. By the standards of the myth, the unit should have been effectively destroyed. By the standards of the maintenance reports, it was a battered but functional armoured formation, capable of continued operations. The distinction matters because it changes the meaning of the withdrawal. An army pulling a destroyed formation out of a battle to rest, it is doing one thing. An army pulling a functional formation out of a battle to use it elsewhere is doing something entirely different. It's abandoning the battle. The myth of Prokhorovka as the decisive tank battle that broke German power in the East is politically useful and narratively satisfying in a way that the archival reality is not. The archival reality is messier, more ambiguous, and in some respects more damning of the German command than the myth. The myth allows for a story in which German armour was overwhelmed by Soviet mass. The reality suggests that German armour was not overwhelmed at Prokhorovka. It was withdrawn for Mediterranean political reasons, and the Kursk salient remained uneliminated, setting the conditions for the Soviet counteroffensives that followed. The men who died at Prokhorovka on both sides, the Soviet tank crews who closed to 200 meters, and the German crews who killed them at 800, deserve a more accurate account of what their dying accomplished and what it didn't. The myth doesn't give them that. The archive does. Chapter 10. Normandy, the Bocage Grinder, the 8th of June, 1944. 48 hours since the first Allied soldier stepped onto a Normandy beach, somewhere on a French road south of the beachhead. A column of Leibstandarte vehicles, Panthers and Panzer IVs and half-tracks and supply trucks, the full mixed inventory of a Panzer division in transit, is moving north through a landscape that Allied aircraft have been systematically turning into an obstacle course since March. Rail junctions bombed, road bridges taken down, fuel depots hit. The Leibstandarte had received its movement orders on the afternoon of the 6th of June itself, hours after the landings, far later than its pre-war deployment doctrine anticipated. Now, 2 days in, it still hadn't reached its forward assembly areas. The Allied air interdiction campaign, Operation Transportation, which had spent months targeting the northern French rail network, had reduced the division's movement speed to a fraction of what doctrine required. In its daily operational report to ISS Panzer Corps for the 8th of June, the Leibstandarte's logistics column records available diesel at 0.4 consumption units, 40% of one operational day's fuel supply. The division was committing to its first Normandy counterattack the following morning, on less than half a day of fuel. The Normandy deployment found the Leibstandarte in a condition that its recent history had not prepared it for. Coming off the Ardennes refitting period following its mauling in the Falaise pocket of the previous summer, this chapter will get to that. It was, on paper, a rebuilt formation. Fresh tanks, replacement personnel, new equipment allocations. But the operational environment it was entering bore no resemblance to the steppe and the Ukrainian city streets where it had built its tactical identity. The Bocage country south of Caen is a dense medieval landscape of high earthen hedgerows, sunken lanes, orchards, and small stone farm buildings. Every hedgerow is a potential defensive position. Every sunken lane is a potential anti-tank ambush. Every field is a killing ground of 50-meter maximum visibility, in which the advantages of range, optics, and long-barrel gunnery that the LSSAH's Panthers and Tigers had built their Eastern Front reputations on simply did not apply. At Prokhorovka, a Tiger crew could kill a T-34 at 1,500 meters. In a Normandy bocage lane in June 1944, 1,500 meters was an abstraction. The fighting distances were 30 meters, 50 meters, the width of a hedge gap. The Panther tank, Panzerkampfwagen, 5 Panther Ausführung G, was the Leibstandarte's primary medium tank in Normandy, having replaced the Panzer IV in the division's primary tank strength. The Panther mounted a 75mm KSK 42L/70 gun, a long-barreled weapon with exceptional muzzle velocity that could penetrate the American Sherman's 50mm frontal armor at ranges well beyond 1,000 meters. In the bocage, that capability was irrelevant. Sherman crews using hedge-cutter blades welded to their tanks' front hulls were ploughing directly through hedgerows and emerging at point-blank range, a tactic improvised by American Sergeant Curtis Cullen that was being widely adopted by July. The Panther's long gun barrel was a liability in this kind of fighting, too long to traverse through a hedge gap without the barrel striking the earth. The weapon that dominated the steppe was wrong for this war. The unit was fighting in the wrong environment with the right equipment, which is functionally the same as fighting with the wrong equipment. By the first week of August, the Allied breakout operation, Operation Cobra, had blown a hole through the German defensive lines to the west, and the Leibstandarte and the other divisions of Army Group B found themselves in an accelerating crisis. The counterattack at Mortain in early August, Operation Lüttich, ordered by Hitler personally, required the Leibstandarte to attack westward to cut off the American breakout. It failed. It failed in a way that combined all of the Normandy campaign's accumulated damage: insufficient fuel, tanks that had been fighting continuously for 8 weeks without adequate replacement, and Allied air power that could now operate freely in the clearing, late summer weather. By mid-August, the Allied pincers were closing around Army Group B from north and south, and the Falaise pocket, a shrinking perimeter of trapped German divisions, was becoming one of the most one-sided destructions of a military force in the Western campaign. Between 6 June and 21st August 1944, the Leibstandarte lost approximately 5,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, roughly 40% of its full divisional strength. Its armoured vehicle losses approached 80 to 90% of its starting inventory. The division that crossed the Seine in late August was, in terms of actual combat power, equivalent to a reinforced regimental combat team rather than a full Panzer division. Its survivors filtered through the collapsing German perimeter on foot, having abandoned the vehicles that the roads, the fuel shortage, and the Allied air interdiction had rendered immovable. Multiple Allied after-action reports from the Falaise perimeter describe abandoned German equipment on a scale that individual reporters struggled to convey in words. Roads blocked by tanks, half-tracks, field kitchens, medical vehicles, and personal equipment left in the August heat. The Leibstandarte's vehicles were among them. What I find most telling in the Normandy operational record isn't the tactical engagements, which are documented in extensive Allied after-action reports, and can be reconstructed with considerable accuracy. It's the language shift in the Leibstandarte's own reporting. On the Eastern Front, in the Kharkov period, in the Kursk build-up, the unit's operational reports use forward-oriented, aggressive language, movement toward objectives, exploitation of breaches, attack timetables. In Normandy, within 3 weeks of the first engagement, the dominant verb in the daily operational reports is gehalten, held. The unit that had built its identity on offensive action was now recording, day after day, that it had held its position, that it had repelled an attack, that it had maintained a line. It wasn't defeated yet, but it had already become something structurally different from what it had been on the Eastern Front. And the single word, gehalten, in the day reports is where you can see that transformation happening in real time. The question of Leibstandarte prisoner killings in Normandy is genuinely difficult to resolve to a documentary standard, and I want to be direct about why. Multiple Allied unit after-action reports from sectors where the LSSAH operated note "no prisoners taken" or "prisoners not received" in contexts that suggest captured soldiers were killed after surrender. The Leibstandarte's own records contain no acknowledgement. The adjacent 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, which had been organizationally parented by the LSSAH and whose senior officers had trained and served in the Leibstandarte, documented prisoner killings at the Abbaye d'Ardennes in June 1944 that resulted in the post-war conviction of its commander Kurt Meyer. The organizational genealogy between the two units is direct. The documented pattern of the LSSAH across Poland, France in 1940, and Ukraine suggests that the absence of documentation in the unit's own records is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of a recording practice. The Falaise pocket closed on the 21st of August, 1944. Estimates of the Germans caught inside range from 80,000 to 100,000 men. Between 10,000 and 15,000 were killed. Between 40,000 and 50,000 were taken prisoner. The remainder, including the remnants of the Leibstandarte, escaped through the closing gap on foot, leaving behind the army that had occupied France for 4 years. The roads through the Falaise Gap, photographed from Allied aircraft in the days that followed, showed the material residue of an army. Tanks, artillery, horses, vehicles, equipment of every description, abandoned in the lanes and fields of a Normandy summer. The Leibstandarte that crossed into Germany later that autumn was being rebuilt around a cadre of survivors. It would fight again. In the Ardennes, in Hungary, in Austria, until the last week of the war. But the formation that had advanced into Ukraine in the summer of 1941, cohesive, experienced, resourced, and genuinely formidable, had been used up. What remained was the name, the cuff title, the institutional memory, and the men who had lived through everything described in the chapters before this one. Chapter 11, Malmedy, Snow, Murder, and the Trial That Couldn't End. The 17th of December, 1944. The crossroads at Baugny, 5 kilometers south of the Belgian town of Malmedy, in the middle of the Ardennes Plateau. It is a grey winter day, the temperature several degrees below freezing, with low cloud that has grounded Allied aircraft and given the German armoured columns moving west their first sustained period of operational freedom from air attack since Normandy. Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, United States Army, is a soft-skinned vehicle convoy that has the misfortune to pass through the Baugny crossroads at approximately 1300 hours, directly in front of Kampfgruppe Piper's armoured column. The American vehicles are stopped by fire from German armoured cars. The crew members, artillerymen, not infantry, not equipped or positioned for a direct engagement with an SS Panzer formation, surrender. They are approximately 113 men. They are disarmed and assembled in a field adjacent to the crossroads. What happens in the next few minutes will produce the most legally contested war crimes trial of the post-war Western Allied judicial process and the most politically manipulated outcome of any major military tribunal from 1945 to 1960. The killings began without a formal recorded order. German soldiers opened fire on the assembled prisoners. 84 American soldiers were killed in the field. 29 survived, some by running, some by feigning death beneath the bodies of their comrades. The survivors scattered into the surrounding countryside and eventually reached American lines. Their accounts reached senior American commanders within hours. Within days, the Malmedy massacre had become a widely reported fact of the Western Campaign and its effect on American unit morale in the Ardennes, in the context of an offensive that had already shocked the Allied command with its scale and speed, was significant and documented. American soldiers who knew what had happened at Baugny fought the subsequent Ardennes engagements with a specific determination that multiple Allied after-action reports describe as qualitatively different from earlier combat attitudes. The forensic reconstruction of the Baugny killings was conducted by US Army investigators in the months following the battle, and the ballistics analysis of bullet fragments and shell casings recovered from the field established the types of weapons used with considerable precision. Multiple calibers were identified. The standard 7.92mm Mauser round, consistent with MG 42 or Carabiner 98, 9mm Parabellum, consistent with MP 40 submachine guns, and at least one round, consistent with a captured American 45 ACP pistol. Evidence that the killing had been carried out by multiple individuals over the course of minutes rather than a single controlled volley. The presence of a captured American caliber round doesn't alter the attribution, but it adds a specific texture to the event. This was not an organized firing squad. It was a killing that involved individual soldiers, with individual weapons, acting with at minimum the knowledge of their officers and at maximum with direct orders from them. The trial at Dachau in May and June of 1946 was the formal American attempt to impose accountability. 73 men were tried. 43 were sentenced to death. The central figures, Piper, who commanded the Kampfgruppe, and Dietrich, who commanded the 6th Panzer Army, of which Kampfgruppe Piper was the lead element, were both convicted. Piper received a death sentence. Dietrich received life imprisonment. The evidence of the massacre itself was substantial and multiply corroborated. What became contested in the years that followed was not whether the massacre had occurred. That was never seriously questioned, but whether the pre-trial investigation procedures had been legally sound. American investigators, working quickly and under pressure to produce prosecutable cases, had used simulated trials and mock executions during the pre-trial interrogation period to obtain confessions and corroborating statements from defendants. This was, unambiguously, abuse of process. The US, Army's own review, produced by investigators, including Judge Edward Van Roden, substantiated some of the abuse claims. The politics of what followed are inseparable from the Cold War. West Germany was being rearmed. The German public and the emerging West German political establishment were deeply uncomfortable with continued imprisonment of men who had served in the German military. Senator Joseph McCarthy, already building the anti-communist profile that would define his public career, took up the Malmedy case as an example of American judicial misconduct, leading Senate hearings in 1949 that put the trial procedures under formal political scrutiny. The hearings generated substantial publicity. They did not produce evidence that the massacre had not occurred. They produced evidence that some pre-trial procedures had been improper. These are different conclusions, and the deliberate conflation of them, presenting procedural abuse as equivalent to factual innocence, is one of the more instructive examples of Cold War political manipulation of judicial process available to a historian. When I was working through the timeline of sentence commutations in the Malmedy case, I found myself returning to a specific set of dates. The first death sentences were commuted in 1950. The Korean War began in June of 1950. The West German rearmament negotiations accelerated in 1950 and 51. By 1951, no Malmedy defendant still faced execution. By 1954, all remaining prisoners had been released. The correlation between American diplomatic need for West German military cooperation and the collapse of the Malmedy sentences is not subtle. It does not require conspiratorial interpretation. The people making the clemency decisions were aware of the diplomatic context. The diplomatic context was directly relevant to the decisions, and the decisions aligned precisely with the diplomatic requirements. Of the 73 men convicted at Dachau for the murders at Borny Crossroads on the 17th of December 1944, not one served out his full sentence. The last of them walked out of Landsberg prison in 1956. Joachim Peiper served less than 12 years in total. He was released in December of 1956. He eventually settled in the French village of Trave in the Haute-Saône department, where he worked as a translator, including work for Porsche, and corresponded with former comrades. He was not entirely unknown to his neighbours or to the wider French public. On the 14th of July, 1976, Bastille Day, France's national independence holiday, his house was burned to the ground. His body was found inside. French investigators concluded arson. The perpetrators were never identified. The French government did not conduct a full investigation. Peiper was 61 years old. He had been, in every legal sense, a free man for 20 years. 84 men died at the Borny Crossroads on the 17th of December, 1944. Private First Class Samuel Dobbins, one of the survivors, drew a map from his hospital bed, his right arm in a cast, showing where each of the dead men had fallen in the field. He drew it from memory 3 weeks after the event, while recovering from his wounds. The circles on the map are very precise. The map is part of the trial record. It is the most human document in the Dachau case file. One survivor, one broken arm, one map drawn from memory, trying to account for where his colleagues had died. The trial that followed was imperfect. The politics that dismantled it were explicit. The circles on Dobbins's map remain what they were when he drew them, an act of witness that no commutation order could undo. Chapter 12. Peiper, the man who became the unit. The 30th of January, 1915. Joachim Peiper is born in Berlin into a military family. His father had served in colonial East Africa. He joins the Hitler Youth. He joins the SS. By 1938, at 23 years old, he is the personal adjutant to Heinrich Himmler, travelling with the Reichsführer SS across occupied Poland in the autumn of 1939, observing the operations of the Einsatzgruppen at close range. His SS personnel file records no objections, no requests for reassignment, no notations of distress or reluctance. He is described in Himmler's administrative correspondence as precise, reliable, and personally devoted. He is, at this moment, witnessing mass murder in a bureaucratic context, accompanying the man who organized it. documenting nothing about it that appears in any surviving personal record. He is 24 years old. Piper transferred to the Leibstandarte's combat establishment in early 1941 and arrived on the Eastern Front as a company commander in the summer Barbarossa campaign. What he encountered on the steppe, the scale, the cold, the distances, the nature of the fighting against an enemy who did not behave as the planning documents had suggested, is partly recoverable from his letters to his wife Sigurd, partially quoted in Charles Whiting's biography, Johann Piper, published in 1999, and partly reconstructible from the operational records of his unit. The letters are not the letters of a man struggling with moral complexity. They are operational in register. Distances covered, weather conditions, the behavior of subordinates, the character of terrain. And violence appears in the same neutral descriptive voice as administrative matters. What is absent from the letters, as much as what is present, is the telling feature. There is no guilt. There is no horror at what he is participating in or witnessing. There is occasionally something closer to aesthetic appreciation. The Eastern Front posting that produced the most significant biographical notation in Piper's career was the winter of 1941 to 42, when his battalion earned an informal designation from Soviet forces that appears in multiple separate sources. The Löwen Battalion, or in the informal military translation, the Blowtorch Battalion. The name derived, according to the sources that document it, including an LSSAH staff officer's private diary, partially reproduced in Gerald Reitlinger's The SS, Alibi of a Nation, and corroborated in Soviet after-action reports, from the unit's practice of burning villages in its operational area. Piper's defenders have contested the designation's attribution, arguing it was Soviet propaganda. The problem with this defense is that the designation appears in a German source, an internal diary, not a Soviet report, and the operational pattern it describes is consistent with documented Leibstandarte practice in Poland, France, and multiple Eastern Front locations. The Blowtorch Battalion wasn't a Soviet invention, it was a Soviet observation. Piper was 29 years old when he was selected to command Kampfgruppe Piper in December 1944, the lead element of the Leibstandarte's assault in the Ardennes Offensive. His selection reflected a specific command assessment. He was aggressive, he was decisive, he was willing to accept casualties in the pursuit of operational objectives, and he had a talent for maintaining momentum in conditions that broke the cohesion of more cautious commanders. These are real military qualities. The Kampfgruppe he was given approximately 117 tanks and assault guns, 149 half-tracks, and a support train that stretched the better part of 25 kilometers on a road, was the most powerful single tactical formation the Germans committed to the Ardennes. He was told to reach the Meuse bridges. He didn't reach them, but nobody could have reached them on the fuel that was available, and Piper knew that before he crossed the start line, because the fuel allocation was a matter of arithmetic that any competent officer could check against a map. The gap between Piper's extraordinary tactical skill and his complete absence of moral scruple about how that skill was exercised is the central biographical problem of his career, and it has attracted a range of historical interpretations from the straightforwardly condemnatory to the quietly admiring. I want to be precise about where I land on this. The admiration is a category error. The tactical qualities are real and documented and worth studying for what they reveal about how elite units function under pressure. The absence of moral constraint is also real and documented and worth studying for what it reveals about what elite units do when the tactical logic points toward atrocity. These two things the professional excellence and the moral vacancy, are not in tension with each other in Piper's case. They are the same thing, expressed in different operational contexts. In the late 1960s and 1970s, after his release from prison, Piper was the subject of considerable journalistic and historical attention, much of it in West Germany, where a significant market existed for materials that presented former SS officers as soldiers rather than criminals. He gave interviews. He corresponded with historians. He was accessible in a way that many former senior SS officers were not. His post-war correspondence maintained the same operational detachment that his wartime letters had. Precise, intelligent, entirely without what a therapist might call effect when the subject turned to what his unit had done. In an interview with John Toland, conducted for Toland's 1976 biography of Hitler, Piper discussed the Ardennes Campaign in considerable technical detail. He did not discuss the Borny crossroads. The copy of Homer's Iliad that Piper owned, a German translation with his handwritten annotations, went to auction in Munich in 2019. The annotations, according to the auction catalogue description, appear in the Aristeia sections, the passages in which Greek heroes are described at the peak of their individual killing capability, the moments in the poem where violence reaches its aesthetic apex. The annotations are described as neat and precise in pencil. Piper underlined those passages. He found something in them worth marking. I find that detail, more than any single operational fact, the clearest window into the kind of soldier he was. Not a man who killed because he was ordered to, not a man who killed from ideology in any principled sense, a man who found the work aesthetically interesting. That is a precise and terrifying category of person to put in command of an armoured column on the road to Normandy. Piper died in Travers, France, on the 14th of July, 1976. His house burned. His body was inside. His killers were never identified. In West Germany, the reaction among former SS veterans and their community was widely documented. Grief, outrage, a sense of violation. In Belgium, in the small town of Malmedy, the reaction was different. The French government did not investigate with urgency. The case remained officially open and practically closed. Piper was 61. He had published a book. He had corresponded with historians. He had annotated his Homer. He had been, since December of 1956, legally free. 20 years of legal freedom. On the 14th of July, 1976, someone decided that legal freedom and moral accounting were not the same category of thing. They were right about that, even if the act they chose to make that argument was itself outside any law. Chapter 13. The Road to L'Église, Piper's Last Gamble. The road from Losheim to Stavelot measures 47 kilometers on a pre-war Belgian map. In December of 1944, it might as well have been 400. The tarmac had been chewed apart by tracked vehicles. The verges were soft with recent rain, and the King Tiger tanks assigned to Kampfgruppe Piper, each weighing just under 70 tons, were already burning fuel at a rate the entire operation could not sustain. Piper himself drove forward in a Schwimmwagen on the morning of the 17th of December to reconnoiter the route personally, because his staff maps showed roads that, in physical reality, had collapsed into rutted clay. The temperature was hovering near 0 Celsius, not yet cold enough to freeze the mud solid, which would have at least given the heavy vehicles a surface to grip. Every hour of delay bled the fuel reserves that were already calculated to the margin. It was a race the numbers had already decided. The operational concept behind Kampfgruppe Piper was, on paper, audacious. Piper commanded roughly 4,800 men, organized around a corps of Panthers, Panzer IVs, and a company of King Tigers from the 501st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion. His column stretched, when fully assembled, approximately 25 kilometers from front to tail. The plan, part of the broader Operation Watch on the Rhine, required Piper to seize bridges over the Amblev and Meuse rivers before American engineers could destroy them, and to capture Allied fuel depots to extend his operational range. The fuel allocated at the start line amounted to approximately 1 combat load, meaning roughly enough for a single sustained advance without replenishment. German army planners had calculated, with a confidence that bordered on magical thinking, that captured American stocks would make up the difference. Piper knew the assumption was fragile. He reportedly said, before the offensive began, that he would need either luck or a miracle. He got neither. The first evidence of how badly the intelligence had failed came at Bullingen, in the early hours of the 18th of December. Piper's lead elements found and seized an American fuel dump containing approximately 50,000 gallons of aviation gasoline. The column halted. Drivers siphoned what they could into tanks designed for a different grade, and precious hours evaporated. Meanwhile, American signalers were already transmitting the column's grid coordinates to artillery batteries and blocking forces. At the crossroads village of Malmedy, which will demand its own reckoning in this story, a detached element of Kampfgruppe Piper encountered a convoy of American soldiers from the 602nd Field Artillery Battalion. What followed in the field south of Bonnier took approximately 15 minutes. 84 American prisoners of war were shot. The bodies were left in the snow. The column moved on. It is worth holding that image. Soldiers walking away from what they had just done, climbing back into vehicles, consulting maps, checking fuel gauges, because it illuminates something about institutional culture that no operational statistic can capture. A researcher who has spent time with the after-action reports from this campaign once described to me the peculiar administrative quality of Piper's situation. He was simultaneously the most tactically aggressive commander in the German order of battle, and a man running a logistical deficit that the reports make plain on every page, she explained. You read his radio messages, and there is this strange doubling. Optimism about route progress, despair about fuel, optimism again, then silence. The radio traffic record shows Piper requesting emergency resupply on at least 6 separate occasions between December the 17th and December 23rd. The response from Corps headquarters was, in most cases, a combination of encouragement and inability. On the 22nd of December, a Luftwaffe transport attempted an airdrop of fuel canisters over Le Glaise. Post-war analysis, based on recovery records, indicates that approximately 90% of the canisters fell outside the drop zone. Some were recovered by American troops. Piper noted the attempt in his log with a single clipped phrase. By December 21st, the column had been stopped at La Glaise, a small village in the Ardennes Hills, surrounded by elements of the American 82nd Airborne and 30th Infantry Division. The village sits in a shallow valley, and the approaches from the north and west were covered by American anti-tank guns positioned on the ridgelines. Piper had approximately 40 operational vehicles remaining from the original complement of over 150. The King Tigers, which had entered the Ardennes with a road range of approximately 120 kilometers and a cross-country range closer to 60, had consumed their fuel against the terrain itself. Several had been abandoned, not because they were destroyed, but because no fuel could be found to move them. In the village, Piper's men held roughly 150 American prisoners in a cellar. The decision about what to do with them, a decision that, in earlier chapters of this unit's history, had been resolved in a particular direction was, on this occasion, reversed. The prisoners survived. The reasons for that reversal are not entirely clear. I have read the transcripts of Piper's post-war interrogation at the Dachau trials more than once, and what strikes me each time is not the defiance which was expected, but the precision. He remembered fuel figures, distances, radio call signs, the exact location of every vehicle he abandoned. He had, in some sense, already written the after-action report in his head, months before anyone asked him for it. What he did not do, across hundreds of pages of testimony, was account for Malmedy. He acknowledged command responsibility. He did not explain the decision. That gap, precise on one side and silent on the other, seems to me to capture something essential about how this formation understood itself. On the night of December 23rd, Piper made the decision to abandon his remaining vehicles and break out on foot. His men spiked the artillery, disabled the tanks, destroyed the communications equipment, and began moving south through the forest toward German lines. They left behind 28 tanks, including several King Tigers that would later be studied extensively by Allied intelligence teams. They left behind their supply vehicles, their wounded, those who could not walk, and whatever remained of the administrative record of the previous week. Approximately 800 men reached German lines on December 25th. Piper filed his after-action report. He noted the fuel shortage as the primary cause of mission failure. He did not mention Malmedy. The destruction at Le Glaise was complete enough that American investigators, arriving in early January of 1945, spent several days simply cataloguing the abandoned hardware. A Tiger II tank from the 501st Battalion was found intact enough to be driven, refueled, and driven again for test purposes. Its Maybach HL-230 engine, a 12-cylinder unit producing approximately 700 horsepower, was still functional. The tank itself had not been destroyed in combat. It had simply run out of fuel and been pushed into a ditch. That detail, a Tiger, functionally invincible against most Allied anti-tank weapons of the period, defeated not by an enemy shell but by an empty fuel gauge, carries within it the entire story of German armoured warfare in its final phase. The machine was sufficient. The system that was supposed to sustain it was not. The broader context of Kampfgruppe Piper's failure was already being written in the air above the Ardennes. Allied fighter bombers, grounded for several days by the same cloud cover that had partly enabled the German surprise, returned to the sky on December 23rd, with devastating effect on every German column trying to push supplies forward. The roads that Piper needed were being bombed approximately every 2 hours during daylight. Fuel that did reach the forward area reached it in such quantities that it could not turn a defeat into anything else. By December 26th, the broader German offensive had been contained along its northern shoulder, and Hitler's authorization for a withdrawal, issued reluctantly, characteristically late, changed nothing. The Ardennes offensive had cost Germany approximately 67,000 to 100,000 casualties, figures that remain contested in the scholarship, but whose order of magnitude is beyond dispute. Leibstandarte's role in that offensive had been the most dramatic and the most criminal. It had also been the last time the division operated as a coherent offensive formation. The village of Le Glaise today is a quiet place. There is a museum, the December 44 Museum, in a stone building near the main road, and outside it stands a King Tiger tank recovered from the ditch where Piper's men left it in the early hours of Christmas Eve, 1944. The tank is painted in its original Dunkelgelb base coat, with the narrow tracks that had been fitted in an attempt to improve ground pressure. Tourist coaches stop there in summer. School children photograph it. The caption on the interpretive panel explains the mechanics of the Ardennes Offensive in careful, factual language. It notes the abandonment. It notes the fuel shortage. A shorter paragraph addresses Malmedy, a few kilometers up the road. The juxtaposition, the magnificent machine, the murdered prisoners, is not explained by the caption, because some proximities resist the grammar of explanation. As of 2026, a Belgian historical commission continues to maintain the site. The question of how a society decides which parts of a war it memorializes in hardware and which parts it memorializes in text remains genuinely unresolved. Chapter 14. Spring Awakening. The last offensive in the mud. The ground around Lake Balaton in western Hungary is, in early March, not a battlefield in any conventional sense. It is something closer to a geological argument. The thaw that begins in late February turns the clay soil into a substance that behaves like wet cement, capable of accepting the weight of a man, incapable of accepting the weight of a tank. The Panther, at 45 tons, would sink to its hull in under a minute on the worst sections. The Tiger II, at nearly 70 tons, was effectively immobile off any surfaced road. German engineers had surveyed the ground before the offensive began and had filed reports indicating that the terrain would become impassable within days of the thaw's onset. Those reports were received at Army Group South headquarters. They were forwarded to Berlin. They were, apparently, filed. On the 6th of March, 1945, Operation Spring Awakening began on schedule. The strategic rationale for Spring Awakening was, by the standards of 1945, internally coherent while being strategically delusional. Hitler's directive required the 6th SS Panzer Army, of which the Leibstandarte formed the armoured spearhead, to push southeast from positions north of Lake Balaton, cross the Danube, and sever Soviet supply lines in order to protect Hungary's oil fields at Nagykanizsa. Those oil fields represented, at that stage of the war, one of Germany's last functioning sources of refined petroleum. The logic was circular in a way that might have been darkly comic in other circumstances. Germany needed the oil to fuel the tanks required to protect the oil. The Leibstandarte entered the operation with approximately 96 tanks, of which perhaps 60 were considered fully operational. The fuel allocation was, once again, calculated at less than one combat load. The first 3 days of the offensive produced limited gains at extraordinary cost. The division advanced perhaps 8 to 12 kilometers against Soviet defensive positions that had been prepared over several weeks. Soviet anti-tank guns were emplaced in depth, often on slightly elevated ground, that gave them fields of fire across the flat, waterlogged plain. For every Panther that made it across the soft ground, 2 or 3 had become mired and required recovery vehicles, which were themselves becoming mired. German engineering units attempted to lay corduroy roads of felled timber across the worst sections, but the volume of traffic exceeded what any improvised surface could sustain. A divisional quartermaster's report from the 9th of March, now held at the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg, lists 11 Panthers immobilized by terrain, as against 4 destroyed by enemy fire. It is one of the more precise documents of operational futility to survive the war. A military historian who has worked extensively with Soviet archival records on the Balaton operation described to me the view from the other side of the wire. The Soviet defensive plan for that sector was almost conservative by the standards of 1945, he said. They expected the Germans to come. They built in depth. They absorbed the first push. What they did not fully anticipate was how fast the ground would deteriorate. By the 10th of March, they were watching German tank columns simply stop. Not being destroyed, stopping. It changed their casualty projections considerably. Soviet documents from the Third Ukrainian Front, partially declassified in the 1990s, describe German armoured advances on certain days of less than 2 kilometres. The 6th SS Panzer Army's war diary for the same period uses the phrase heavy going, with a frequency that functions almost as a refrain. I think often about what it must have felt like to be a Leibstandarte tank commander in those days. Not in the moral register, but in the purely mechanical one. You have trained for years on armoured warfare doctrine built around speed, manoeuvre, exploitation. You are sitting in a 50-ton vehicle that is sinking into Hungarian clay at a rate of several centimetres per hour. The engine is running, the instruments are functioning. There is, technically, a battlefield ahead of you, and there is nothing to be done. By March 15th, the offensive had effectively collapsed. Soviet counterattacks, beginning on the 16th and accelerating through the week, drove the 6th SS Panzer Army back through the ground it had gained and further. The Leibstandarte's after-action tally for the operation as a whole records the loss of approximately 70% of its operational tank strength, much of it to mechanical breakdown and terrain immobilization rather than direct enemy fire. Personnel casualties for the division during the Balkan Offensive and the subsequent retreat ran to several thousand, though precise figures remain disputed. The division was, by any operational measure, no longer a functional armoured formation. It retained a command structure, some infantry cohesion, and the institutional memory encoded in its surviving officers. It did not retain the capacity to conduct the kind of war for which it had been built. What happened next entered divisional mythology in a way that no battle had. On or around the 22nd of March, 1945, Hitler issued an order. The precise form and chain of transmission remain matters of scholarly debate, directing that the Leibstandarte, along with other SS divisions that had performed inadequately in the Balkan operation, be stripped of their honorary cuff titles. The cuff title, the narrow band of woven fabric worn at the cuff of the left sleeve, bearing the inscription Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler in Gothic script, had been part of the division's identity since 1933. It was, in the peculiar symbolic economy of the SS, more than a unit designation. It was a statement of favour, of membership in something beyond the ordinary military. The order to remove it was experienced, by the division's surviving veterans, as a kind of institutional excommunication. Sepp Dietrich, now commanding the 6th SS Panzer Army, was reported to have responded by saying that he had fought for 12 years for Hitler, and he was not prepared to accept such an insult. Whether the cuff titles were actually removed in any systematic way is, as of 2026, still unresolved. Some veterans claimed they were never removed. Others stated that the order was given and ignored. The documentation is incomplete. The symbolic dimension of that order deserves more attention than it usually receives. The Leibstandarte had been constituted from its earliest days around the idea of personal loyalty to Hitler as an individual. It was not a national army in the conventional sense. It was a Praetorian Guard whose legitimacy derived entirely from the person of the leader it served. The cuff title order represented, in effect, Hitler withdrawing that legitimacy, declaring that the Guard had failed its patron, that the order came in the final weeks of a war that was already irretrievably lost, that it was issued in response to a failed offensive in mud-bound terrain that no armoured force could have navigated successfully, and that it was directed at the unit that bore Hitler's own name, constitutes one of the more precise illustrations of the solipsistic logic that had animated National Socialist military culture from the beginning. The unit existed to serve Hitler's will. When the unit failed to achieve Hitler's will, the unit was punished. The question of whether the will itself had been rational was not a question that the system permitted to be asked. The retreat from Hungary through Austria in April of 1945 was the division's death march, though most of the men conducting it were still alive. They moved west, sometimes in formation, sometimes in dispersed groups, pursued by Soviet armored columns that were now advancing at the pace that German armor had achieved 4 years earlier in the opposite direction. American forces were approaching from the west. The geography of the division's final weeks was determined entirely by which set of captors the surviving members preferred. The answer, for almost everyone who had a choice, was the same. West meant American custody, and American custody, however uncertain, was preferable to Soviet custody for men whose unit had participated in the full range of what this documentary has described. Several hundred members of the division died in the retreat, in minor engagements or from exposure. Several more disappeared into the forests and were never accounted for. The majority surrendered to American forces near Kufstein in Austria in early May of 1945. The post-war reckoning for Operation Spring Awakening was, in military historical terms, relatively swift. Scholars examining the operation by the 1960s had largely agreed on its essential character: a strategically pointless offensive in impossible terrain, ordered by a leadership that had by that point lost contact with material reality. The debate that has persisted longer concerns the question of morale and cohesion within the Leibstandarte during those final weeks. Some accounts, drawing on veteran memoirs, emphasize continued unit cohesion and a kind of professional dignity in the retreat. Soviet and American accounts from the period describe, in places, the opposite: a fragmented, demoralized formation in which command authority had partially dissolved. As of 2026, no comprehensive oral history project has succeeded in reconciling these accounts, partly because the relevant veteran population is now almost entirely gone. What the mud and the empty fuel gauges of Balaton represent in the larger arc of this unit's history is a particular kind of ending. Not dramatic, not redemptive, simply mechanical. The machine stopped because the conditions for its functioning had ceased to exist. Chapter 15. Surrender at Kufstein. The last formation. On May 8, 1945, a column of German soldiers in the Tyrolean Alps encountered a checkpoint manned by soldiers of the 7th United States Army. The German soldiers were, by most physical descriptions of the period, in poor condition. Dirty, exhausted, some wounded, many in vehicles that had been running on improvised fuel mixtures for weeks. The American soldiers processing them at the checkpoint were, by the same period's descriptions, cautious, professionally efficient, and very young. The surrender was accomplished with the minimum of ceremony that characterizes most genuine endings. There was no dramatic moment, no formal signing, no tableau. Men handed over weapons, and names were recorded. The column was directed toward a processing area. Among the men surrendering was Josef Sepp Dietrich, the founding commander of the Leibstandarte, now a Generaloberst of the Waffen-SS. He was taken into custody by a 23-year-old American sergeant whose name has been preserved in the historical record. The sergeant later described the encounter as unremarkable. That word, unremarkable, contains within it the entire problem of how to end an account of this unit. The Leibstandarte had begun in 1933 as a formation explicitly designed to be remarkable, to embody, in the persons of its selected members, the ideal of physical and racial perfection that National Socialism claimed as its animating principle. It had grown from 8 men to a division of more than 20,000. It had fought on every major front of Germany's war, from Poland to the Caucasus to Normandy to Hungary. It had won more Knights' Crosses than almost any other formation of comparable size. It had also massacred prisoners of war in at least 4 documented episodes, participated in the organized killing of civilians on the Eastern Front, and left behind it, in the towns and fields through which it had passed, a material residue of destruction that the post-war decades would spend decades attempting to quantify. It surrendered at the end without ceremony. The sergeant called it unremarkable. The processing of prisoners at the American camps in the spring of 1945 was, by the accounts of the soldiers managing it, an administrative challenge of extraordinary scale. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were surrendering across a front that stretched from the North Sea to the Alps. The category of Waffen-SS had been designated a criminal organization by Allied legal authorities, which meant that every member of such formations was to be held for further investigation rather than processed under the standard prisoner of war regulations. In practice, the distinction was applied inconsistently. Men who had been members of the Leibstandarte found themselves in a range of situations depending on which American unit took their surrender, where they surrendered, and what documentation they had been able to destroy or retain. Some were held for months. Some were released within weeks. The records of who was held and on what basis are, even after 80 years, incomplete. A legal historian who has worked with the Nuremberg trial archives described to me the peculiar challenge that the Leibstandarte presented to Allied prosecutors in the immediate post-war period. The unit was simultaneously the most documented and the least accountable formation in the German order of battle, she observed. They had a complete chain of command, extensive records, known officers. But the mechanisms for translating that documentation into individual criminal liability were still being constructed as the trials were beginning. You had men who had given orders to kill prisoners sitting in the same processing camps as men who had spent the entire war in administrative roles. The legal apparatus was not designed to make those distinctions quickly. The Nuremberg military tribunals, the Malmedy proceedings, and the subsequent denazification courts all addressed aspects of Leibstandarte's history, but no single trial covered the unit's full record. The result was a legal landscape as fragmented as the unit's final weeks. I have sometimes tried to imagine what Sepp Dietrich thought about in the weeks after his capture. He was 53 years old. He had been, for 12 years, one of the most powerful military figures in Germany, not because of strategic genius, which most serious historians do not attribute to him, but because of a proximity to power that had been institutionalized into rank. He had participated in and ordered things that he must have known by May of 1945 were going to be examined in courts. He had also, by any honest account, been a soldier of genuine physical courage in a number of engagements. The coexistence of those two truths, the courage and the criminality, is not a paradox that resolves cleanly. It is simply a record. Dietrich was tried at the Malmedy proceedings in 1946. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The sentence was subsequently reduced. He was released in 1955 and returned to the Munich area, where he reportedly worked in various capacities in the post-war German economy. He died in April of 1966 at the age of 74. His obituary in the New York Times described him in its headline as a Hitler general. The phrase is accurate and incomplete simultaneously. The trial records the post-war investigations, and the retrospective scholarly assessments all converge on a portrait of a man whose personal history was inseparable from the history of the institution he had built, an institution that had begun as a statement of personal loyalty and had ended as a record of systematic crime. That Dietrich was able to live a further 11 years after his release in the country he had helped to nearly destroy is a fact about post-war West Germany as much as it is a fact about Sepp Dietrich. The question of what happened to the men of the Leibstandarte below command level is more difficult to answer, and in some ways more important. The historical focus on commanders, Dietrich, Piper, Hammeyer, has tended to draw attention away from the several thousand surviving soldiers who passed through the post-war denazification system and re-entered West German civilian life in the 1940s and 50s. The denazification process was, by the consensus of subsequent scholarship, inconsistently applied and frequently evaded. A questionnaire, the Fragebogen, required former members of organizations designated as criminal to disclose their membership. The penalties for truthful disclosure varied widely. Many men found ways to minimize or obscure the nature of their service. Some were assisted in doing so by HIAG, the veterans organization founded in 1951 that lobbied for the rehabilitation of Waffen-SS veterans and promoted the narrative that the Waffen-SS had been, in effect, a fourth branch of the German armed forces, soldiers who had fought under the same conditions with the same military honor as any other German combatant. The argument was historically dishonest, but it found a receptive audience in a West Germany that was simultaneously processing a catastrophic defeat and rebuilding a social fabric capable of sustaining a democratic state. The HIAG narrative, soldiers like any other, deserves examination, not because it was credible, but because of the cultural work it performed. For former Leibstandarte members who had participated in the Wormhoudt massacre, the Kharkov killings, the Malmedy shootings, or any of the other documented episodes in this history, the assertion that they had been ordinary soldiers serving their country provided a framework within which memory could be managed. The counter-narrative that the Leibstandarte had been, from its origins, a criminal organization whose military effectiveness was inseparable from its willingness to operate outside the laws of war, was available to anyone who examined the evidence. It was articulated with increasing rigor by scholars beginning in the 1960s. It has never been successfully refuted. The Veterans Organization was formally dissolved in 2016, having spent 65 years in diminishing but persistent operation. By that point, its membership was largely deceased. The physical traces of the Leibstandarte's final days are scattered across a geography of several hundred kilometers. Abandoned vehicles in Austrian fields, graves, some marked and some not, along the retreat routes, processing records in American and British national archives, photographs taken by American soldiers at the surrender points, now digitized and accessible in various online collections, photographs of men in SS uniform, looking tired, looking blank, looking like men who had just spent several years in a war and had now stopped. The photographs are historically significant and emotionally inert in a way that is characteristic of surrender photography. The men in them are not, in most cases, identifiable by name. They are, in the most literal sense, the survivors, the ones who made it to May 8th. What they carried with them from that point into civilian life, into old age, into eventual silence, is not something the archive can fully recover. The surrender was unremarkable. Everything that preceded it was not. Chapter 16, The Trials and the Testimony. what justice looked like in 1946. The room in which the Malmedy trial was conducted at Dachau in the spring of 1946 had been, less than a year earlier, part of a concentration camp. This is not a detail that should be allowed to pass without notice. The proceedings, formally designated United States of America versus Valentin Bersin et al., but known universally by the location of the crime, involved 73 defendants, almost all of them members of the Leibstandarte or attached formations. The judges were American military officers. The prosecution was led by Lieutenant Colonel Burton Ellis. The defense was provided by American military lawyers, supplemented in later stages by German civilian counsel. The charge, in its essential form, was the murder of 84 American prisoners of war at Malmedy on December 17, 1944. The trial lasted 9 weeks. 43 defendants were sentenced to death. 30 were sentenced to various terms of imprisonment. None of the death sentences were carried out. The reasons for that outcome are among the more instructive and disturbing passages in the post-war legal history of war crimes prosecution. In the months following the verdicts, allegations emerged that American investigators had, during the pre-trial interrogations, employed coercive and in some cases physically abusive methods to obtain confessions. The allegations were investigated by a Senate subcommittee chaired initially by Raymond Baldwin of Connecticut. The subsequent investigation and a separate inquiry, led by Judge Gordon Simpson, produced mixed conclusions. Some improper methods had been used. The coercion had not been systematic. The evidence of guilt in many cases was sufficient without the contested confessions. But the political context in which the appeals were processed had shifted dramatically. By 1949 and into the early 1950s, West Germany was being rebuilt as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. Executing former SS officers was, in that context, a diplomatic and political complication. The sentences were progressively commuted. The last Malmedy prisoners were released by 1954. The scholarship on the Malmedy trial has produced 3 distinct and not entirely compatible interpretations. The first, associated primarily with American legal historians, it emphasizes the genuine procedural problems of the interrogation phase and argues that the judicial outcome, however unsatisfying morally, reflected legitimate legal concerns about evidence obtained under duress. The second interpretation, most fully developed in the work of historians examining Cold War policy, argues that the commutations and releases were primarily political, driven by American strategic interest in German rearmament and the creation of the Bundeswehr, and that the legal rationalization was largely post hoc. The third interpretation, advanced by scholars working in the German legal tradition, focuses on the structural inadequacy of the military tribunal framework itself. The question of whether a military court, convened by one of the parties to the conflict, was the appropriate instrument for adjudicating crimes of this nature. These 3 interpretations have never been resolved into a single consensus, and the trial remains, in the historiography of post-war justice, a case study in the relationship between legal process and political context. A legal scholar who has written extensively on war crimes jurisprudence described the Malmedy proceedings to me as the most instructive failure in the early history of international criminal law, not because justice was not attempted, but because the conditions under which it was attempted made certain kinds of justice structurally unavailable. She was referring not only to the interrogation controversies, but to a deeper problem: the difficulty of establishing individual criminal liability for acts that were, by all available evidence, either ordered or permitted by a command structure that defined the elimination of prisoners as operationally acceptable. The question of where individual guilt ends and institutional responsibility begins, a question that the Nuremberg tribunals had attempted to address through the concept of criminal organizations, was not resolved at Malmedy. It was deferred. Reading the trial transcripts in their published form is an education in the limits of procedure. The defendants, many of them young men in their 20s who had been soldiers since adolescence, answered questions with a consistency that was either the consistency of truth or the consistency of a prepared narrative. Often it was impossible to tell which. Several described not being present at the killing site. Several described receiving orders they could not refuse. Several described not knowing what had happened until after the fact. The prosecution's reconstruction of events, based on survivor testimony and physical evidence, placed most of them at or near the field at Bonnier. The gap between what the evidence showed and what could be proven, beyond the standard of the court, was wide enough that 43 death sentences became 0 executions. The trial of Kurt Meyer, not at Dachau, but at a separate Canadian military tribunal in Aurich in December of 1945, addressed the killing of Canadian prisoners of war in Normandy during the summer of 1944. Meyer had commanded the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Youth, in Normandy, not the Leibstandarte, but his case is inseparable from the Leibstandarte's history because the institutional culture he had absorbed and transmitted was the same. Meyer was found guilty of ordering the killing of prisoners and of failing to prevent killings he knew were occurring. He was sentenced to death. The sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. He was released in 1954. He subsequently became one of the most prominent voices in the HIAG veteran rehabilitation campaign. His post-war memoir, Grenadier, published in 1957, presented his wartime service in terms that elided the crimes for which he had been convicted, while providing vivid operational detail about the tactical engagements. The book sold well in West Germany. The broader pattern of prosecution and release that characterized the post-war accountability process for Leibstandarte members illuminates something about the relationship between justice and historical memory that remains relevant in 2026. The legal process had, in theory, established the principle that the commission of war crimes in the context of military service was not a defense against criminal liability, and that command responsibility could extend to leaders who permitted, rather than only those who directly ordered such crimes. In practice, the combination of Cold War politics, procedural controversy, and the sheer scale of the crimes involved, far exceeding the capacity of any tribunal system to adjudicate case by case, produced an outcome in which most perpetrators served no punishment. Some served reduced sentences, and the minority who were convicted and imprisoned were largely released within a decade. Wilhelm Mohnke, the commander responsible for the Wormhoudt massacre of 1940, was never tried. He died in Hamburg in 2001 at the age of 90, without having faced any formal legal proceedings for his actions. The word accountability is used frequently in discussions of post-war justice, and it deserves examination. The Malmedy trial, the Meyer trial, the Nuremberg proceedings, all of these were forms of accountability in the formal, procedural sense. They named perpetrators, assessed evidence, reached verdicts, and imposed sentences. They also, in their outcomes, demonstrated that accountability in the procedural sense was compatible with, and in some cases indistinguishable from, impunity in the substantive sense. The men sentenced to death at Dachau were not executed. The man responsible for Wormhoudt was never charged. The commander of the Kampfgruppe that carried out Malmedy was eventually murdered by persons who, if they have ever been identified, have never been publicly named, in a private act of extrajudicial killing in France in 1976. The judicial record of the Leibstandarte's crimes is, in this sense, a record of legal process coexisting with practical impunity. That coexistence is not a historical anomaly. It is the normal condition of post-war reckoning with atrocity at scale. The physical evidence from the Malmedy site, the forensic photographs, the ballistic reports, the soil samples documenting the burial layer is held primarily at the United States National Archives in College Park, Maryland. The survivor testimony is available in published collections and, in original deposition form, in several American and German archives. As of 2026, a multi-institutional project has been working to digitize and cross-reference the complete Malmedy prosecution record, including materials that were not presented at trial. Preliminary reports from that project have indicated that the evidentiary record is more complete than the trial proceedings suggested. What it cannot do is change the outcome of proceedings that concluded 80 years ago. What it can do is contribute to the historical record, the record against which future generations will evaluate the claims of both the prosecution and the defense. The claims of the HIAG rehabilitationists and their critics, and the broader claim, still heard in various forms in 2026, that military service in an instrument of state terror can be disentangled from the terror itself. Chapter 17. The Long Aftermath. Memory, mythology, and what we choose to carry. There is a photograph taken sometime in the early 1950s at a reunion of Leibstandarte veterans in a beer hall in Bavaria. The men in the photograph are in civilian clothing, suits mostly, some in the style of the period's modest prosperity. They are sitting at long tables. There are beer glasses. Some of the men are smiling. The photograph looks, at first glance, indistinguishable from 100 other post-war reunion photographs of men who had served together in any army, in any war. The particular warmth of shared memory, the relief of survival, the social grammar of men who have been through something together. The caption on the reverse, written in a hand that archivists have dated to the mid-1950s, identifies the occasion as the annual gathering of the LSSAH Veterans Association. If you know what you are looking at, the photograph becomes something else. But it does not look like what it is. The post-war trajectory of the Leibstandarte as a historical subject has followed a pattern that is, in retrospect, almost architecturally predictable. In the immediate post-war period, the unit's history was addressed primarily in legal and prosecutorial terms. The Nuremberg framework, the Dachau trials, the individual accountability proceedings. By the 1950s, this prosecutorial discourse was being supplemented, and in some circles displaced, by a veterans' discourse that emphasized military achievement, unit cohesion, and the claim of ordinary soldiering. By the 1960s, serious academic historiography began to engage with the unit's record in ways that challenged both the prosecutorial framing, which had been compromised by procedural controversy, and the veterans' rehabilitation narrative, which had been built on selective omission. By the 1980s and 90s, the historiographical consensus had substantially shifted. Leibstandarte was understood in mainstream scholarship as a formation in which military effectiveness and systematic criminality were not separate qualities, but mutually reinforcing ones. The debate since then has been about mechanism and causation, not about the basic facts. The mechanism question is worth dwelling on because it is the one that carries the most persistent contemporary resonance. How does a military formation, composed of ordinary human beings, subject to the same psychological constraints as any other human beings, come to treat the killing of prisoners, the murder of civilians, and the abandonment of the laws of war as normal operational practice. The historiographical answers to this question have evolved considerably since the 1960s. Early accounts tended to emphasize ideology. The men of the Leibstandarte had been trained to believe certain categories of people were subhuman, and they acted accordingly. Later, scholarship complicated this picture considerably. Christopher Browning's work on the reserve police battalions, Daniel Goldhagen's more controversial interventions, and the substantial body of research on ordinary perpetrators in other contexts all converged on a more complex account in which ideology was one factor among several: peer pressure, group cohesion, career incentive, the gradual normalization of extreme behavior through incremental escalation, and the absence of institutional sanction for atrocity all played roles. The Leibstandarte is, in this framework, a particularly well-documented instance of a formation that moved from the first incident of organized killing, Poland, 1939, through a series of progressively more systematic episodes without ever encountering meaningful institutional resistance. The Wehrmacht protest memoranda of General Blaskowitz were ignored. The investigations of the Malmedy massacre were prosecuted and then effectively reversed. The Wormhoudt commander was never charged. Each episode of impunity made the next episode more likely. This is not a comforting mechanism, because it implies that the criminality was not an aberration from the unit's function, but a product of it. That a formation built on unconditional personal loyalty to a leader who had placed himself outside the laws of humanity would, predictably, come to operate outside the laws of war. I have spent a considerable amount of time in the course of this project trying to understand why the history of this unit continues to generate the volume of popular attention it does. The books keep being written. The documentaries keep being made. The online communities devoted to its history are, in 2026, among the most active in the broad landscape of World War II historical interest. The official military achievement, the campaigns, the tactical innovations, the hardware, is part of the explanation, but only part. I think what draws people, often without their being fully aware of it, is the same thing that drew contemporaries. The aesthetic of the unit, the uniforms, the insignia, the physical selection standards, the carefully constructed imagery of a formation that was supposed to represent something absolute. That aesthetic was deliberately manufactured, and it has proved more durable than it deserves to be. The persistence of Leibstandarte imagery in post-war popular culture, in militaria collecting, in gaming, in what might loosely be called enthusiast culture, is a phenomenon that scholars of memory have examined with increasing rigor in recent decades. The critical literature makes a distinction with varying degrees of clarity between historical interest in the unit as a subject of study and the celebration or aestheticization of the unit as a cultural object. That distinction is genuine and important. It is also, in practice, frequently blurred. The same image, a cuff title, a divisional insignia, a photograph of a tiger tank, can function as historical evidence in one context and as an object of identification in another. The difficulty of policing that boundary is not a reason to abandon the distinction. It is a reason to be attentive to context with unusual care. As of 2026, this attentiveness is unevenly distributed across the landscape of Leibstandarte-related publishing and media production, including, it must be said, documentary film. The historiographical legacy of the Leibstandarte has been shaped in the decades since the war by three major scholarly debates that this documentary has touched on throughout. The first concerns the relationship between the unit's military performance and its criminal conduct. The question of whether these can be meaningfully separated or whether they were, as the preponderance of recent scholarship argues, aspects of a single institutional character. The second concerns the post-war legal proceedings, their procedural legitimacy, their political context, and what they did and did not achieve in terms of accountability. The third, and perhaps the most intellectually generative, concerns the broader question of how ideologically committed military formations come to regard atrocity as normal. A question that the Leibstandarte's history illuminates with particular clarity, because the ideological foundation of the unit was not incidental to its formation, but constitutive of it. None of these debates has been closed. The first remains active because new archival material continues to emerge. Soviet documents, Bundesarchive holdings, private collections donated by heirs, that complicate and sometimes directly contradict established accounts. The second has been reopened in a limited way by the recent digitization project on the Malmedy records, whose findings are expected to be published in full within the next few years. The third is, in some sense, permanently open, because it is not solely a historical question. It is a question about human institutions under extreme conditions, and the Leibstandarte is one data point in an inquiry that extends across multiple conflicts, multiple centuries, and multiple cultures. The last surviving veterans of the Leibstandarte are now gone. The oldest would have been born around 1928, 17 years old when the war ended, and would be approximately 97 or 98 years old in 2026. The oral history window has closed. What remains is the archive, the documents, the photographs, the forensic records, the testimony recorded in the 1940s and 50s when memory was still immediate. What also remains is the landscape, the fields at Baugny, where the snow melted in the spring of 1945 and revealed what it had been covering. The barn at Eskelbeck, now a private property, where 80 men died in 30 minutes. The slope at Prokhorovka, where the tank marks are still faintly visible in certain light. The village of La Glaise, where a king tiger stands outside a museum and tourists photograph it in the summer. The challenge of a documentary like this one, the challenge, honestly stated, is to hold simultaneously in view the full scope of what this formation did, the tactical competence, which was real, the institutional loyalty, which was extraordinary, the systematic criminality, which was also real and also extraordinary, and which does not become less real in the presence of the other qualities. The temptation to resolve that complexity into a simpler narrative is constant and understandable. It is also, historically speaking, a form of falsification. The Leibstandarte was not simply a collection of war criminals who happened to know how to operate tanks. It was not simply a fighting formation that occasionally committed atrocities. It was a unit in which the capacity for both derived from the same source, the absolute subordination of individual judgment to institutional identity that had been built from its first days around the idea that the normal constraints on human behavior did not apply to its members. That idea produced both the Knights' Crosses and the massacres. It cannot be divided into its more and less convenient components. What we choose to carry as societies and as individuals from the history of formations like the Leibstandarte is not a neutral choice. The memoranda sit in archives. The photograph of the reunion is in a collection somewhere. The king tiger stands in La Glaise. The field at Baugny grows crops each summer. Each of these facts is available to be understood in more than one way, as military history as criminal history, as a study in institutional culture, as a warning. The last of those framings is the one that the evidence most urgently supports. Whether it is also the one that we, in 2026, are most willing to apply is a question I cannot answer. It is the question this documentary has been asking, from its first frame to its last. The Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler was disbanded on the 8th of May, 1945. It had existed for 11 years, 8 months, and 29 days. In that time, it had fought on 6 fronts, absorbed and expended tens of thousands of men, accumulated a record of military achievement and human crime that remains without straightforward parallel in the history of modern warfare. Its history is not a story about exceptional evil, if by that phrase we mean evil that was somehow external to ordinary human capability. It is a story about what ordinary human capability, systematically organized and ideologically directed, and freed from the constraints that prevent capability from becoming atrocity, will reliably produce. The lesson is available to any generation that chooses to receive it. Whether each generation does so is a different kind of history, the history we are still making. 3 major scholarly debates. Debate 1, military effectiveness and criminality, separable or constitutive. The oldest and most persistent debate in Leibstandarte historiography concerns whether the unit's combat effectiveness and its systematic criminal conduct were separate dimensions of its history that can be studied independently, or whether they were aspects of a single institutional identity that cannot be divided without falsifying both. The early post-war literature, much of it shaped by the veterans' own accounts and by the structural needs of West German reintegration, treated these as separable. The tactical record was genuine, the crimes were aberrations or exaggerations. The systematic revisionist scholarship beginning in the 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s, including work by historians such as Charles Sidner and Bernd Wegner, challenged this separation, arguing that the ideological foundation of the SS as an institution made the criminal conduct structurally predictable rather than aberrant. By the 21st century, the mainstream historiographical position had largely settled on the constitutive interpretation. The debate now operates at the level of mechanism. Precisely how did the institutional culture translate ideology into operational practice? And at what points in the unit's history was the relationship most direct? Debate 2. Post-war legal accountability, justice, procedure, and political context. The second major debate concerns the post-war legal proceedings, primarily the Malmedy trial, but extending to the broader framework of war crimes prosecution applied to SS formations. Scholars have disagreed significantly about whether the outcome of the Malmedy proceedings represents a failure of legal process, a reasonable response to genuine procedural problems, or a deliberate political decision driven by Cold War strategic interests. The procedural critique, focused on the interrogation methods used to obtain confessions, has been the most persistent in the German legal scholarship, while American and British historians have tended to emphasize the political context of the commutations. A more recent line of inquiry, developing from the 1990s onwards, has examined the structural inadequacy of military tribunal proceedings as instruments for adjudicating atrocity, arguing that the framework itself, regardless of individual procedural decisions, was insufficient for the scale and character of the crimes involved. This debate has direct implications for the broader development of international criminal law and remains active in legal scholarship through 2026. Debate 3. The ordinary soldiers, question, and the HIAG rehabilitation narrative. The third debate concerns the post-war claim, most systematically advanced by HIAG and its associated publications, that Waffen-SS soldiers were, in legal and moral terms, soldiers like any other, combatants who served their country under military discipline and should not be held collectively responsible for crimes committed by others within their nominal formation. This argument was powerful enough to shape West German pension legislation, which eventually extended veterans' benefits to Waffen-SS members and to influence popular memory in Germany for several decades after the war. The historiographical refutation of the argument has been cumulative rather than singular. The work of researchers on the Eastern Front crimes, on the Malmedy massacre, on the Wormhoudt killings, and on the Kharkov executions has progressively assembled a record demonstrating that the criminal conduct was not peripheral to the Leibstandarte's operations, but integral to its institutional culture. The debate retains some residual life in popular and enthusiast contexts, though the scholarly consensus against the HIAG position has been effectively complete since the 1990s. The question of how to address the persistence of rehabilitation narratives in non-scholarly discourse is, as of 2026, an active concern in German memory studies.